But to understand why all of Willow burned to its knees, stake out itself.
We don't sell to her kind here.
What do you need today, Marrow?
You want to buy something, you come back here alone. She can stand outside and wait.
I'll serve her the same as you'd serve me, or you'll lose my custom permanent, and I'll make sure every rancher around here knows exactly why.
Ay, mi Nama.
But this was only the beginning of a 3-year debt this whole town never even knew it was carrying.
Shadow Creek Valley, Arizona Territory, autumn 1880. Jonah Marrow didn't believe in mornings anymore. Not really. He got up because the cattle didn't care what a man believed in, because the fence line didn't mend itself, because if he sat still too long, the quiet of that house behind him would catch up and swallow him whole. So he moved, every day, before the light even had the decency to arrive. 3 years now. 3 years since the fever came through the valley like something with teeth. Took Rachel first, then the child she was carrying, before it ever drew breath. 2 graves under one cottonwood tree, on a rise above the house, where he could see them from the porch if he let himself look, which he didn't. Not anymore. Not since he learned that looking didn't bring anybody back. It just made the coffee go cold in his hand. He was 34 years old. Felt older. Felt like a man wearing another man's boots, walking around in a life that used to fit. The ranch was 3,000 acres of scrub and grass his father had carved out of nothing, back before Jonah was old enough to remember the carving. His father used to say a man didn't own land. Land tolerated a man, if he treated it right, and threw him off the second he stopped paying attention. Jonah had believed that once the way a boy believes anything his father tells him simply, completely, without needing proof. He believed it differently now. Harder. Because he'd learned the same rule applied to people too. You didn't own the ones you loved. You just got to keep them as long as something bigger than you allowed it. And then it stopped allowing it. And there wasn't a single thing a man could do about that, except keep breathing and keep moving. And try not to look at the cottonwood tree too often. The house was low, built against the wind the way his father had built everything squat and stubborn, and made to last. There was a kitchen table with 2 chairs, though only one had scuff marks worn into the floor beneath it from years of use. There was a shelf by the window where Rachel used to keep a blue glass jar full of whatever wildflowers were in season. It was empty now. Had been empty for 3 years. He'd never once thought to take it down. A week before, he'd ridden into Willow Bend for supplies, flour, cartridges, a new hinge for the barn door, and felt the way he always felt in that town, like a man walking through a room where the conversation stops the second he enters and starts up again, quieter, the second he leaves. Willow Bend wasn't a large place. Wasn't a cruel one either, not exactly. Just small enough that everybody's business belonged to everybody. And Jonah's business, the dead wife, the dead child, the ranch he ran alone and stubborn out past the ridge, had long since curdled from sympathy into something closer to discomfort. People didn't know what to do with the grief that didn't heal on schedule. So mostly they left him be, which suited him fine, except on the days it didn't. He'd passed the bank on his way out of town. Seen Sterling Whitfield standing in the window in his clean shirt and his soft hands, watching the street the way a hawk watches a field, patient, unbothered, cataloging. Whitfield had nodded at him once, polite as a knife wrapped in silk, and said something about how a man alone on that much land might do well to consider an offer, should one ever come his way. Jonah hadn't answered, hadn't needed to. He knew the shape of that kind of offer. Well enough knew Whitfield had been circling half the small outfits in the valley for 2 years now, buying up water rights and grazing leases, with a patience that unsettled Jonah more than any outright threat would have. He'd ridden home that evening thinking, not for the first time, that there was something rotten sitting quiet under the surface of Willow Bend, something none of the God-fearing folks filling the church pews on Sunday seemed the least bit interested in noticing. He hadn't thought about that ride into town again. Not for a week. He had a fence to mend and cattle to move and a life to keep small and manageable, and Sterling Whitfield's ambitions were, as far as Jonah was concerned that week, Somebody else's problem entirely. That morning, the one that started all of it, he ate, standing up at the stove the way he always did, because sit down at that table alone still felt like an admission of something he wasn't ready to admit. Coffee, bread, a little of yesterday's beef. Then out the door before the sun had fully cleared the ridge, saddling the gray gelding, riding for the northern fence line. A storm had come through 2 nights back, hard wind and harder rain, and knocked half the posts sideways along the northern boundary. And cattle had a talent for finding the one gap in a fence like it was their life's calling. So he rode, checked posts, reset the ones that needed resetting, thought about nothing in particular, which was the whole point of the exercise. Work as a kind of prayer, work as the only thing quiet enough to keep the bad thoughts from crowding in. He found the tracks around midday, not cattle tracks, not deer, not coyote, boot prints, 6 sets, maybe 7, horses tied, and left standing too long in one place. He could tell by the churned ground, the impatient scuffing, the way the grass had been cropped down flat, where animals had stood restless and bored for longer than a man usually left a horse standing. He crouched down, ran 2 fingers along the edge of one print, fresh, maybe an hour old. His first thought, and he'd be ashamed of this later, though he'd never say so out loud, his first thought was, not my problem. Because that's what 3 years of burying people teaches a man. Keep your head down. Keep your fences up. Don't go looking for other people's trouble, because trouble has a way of following a man home, and Jonah had already lost everything trouble could take from him once. He didn't much feel like finding out what was left to lose, except the tracks led north, toward the ridge that looked down over Willow Bend Creek, toward the place where the Chiricahua band had been camped for 2 months now, since the agency at San Carlos got too crowded and too hungry, and Chief Tocho had led his people to wait out the winter. Somewhere, the game hadn't all been shot out yet. Jonah had seen their fires at night, had traded a little beef for baskets once, back in the summer, when a young man from the camp rode up to the fence and just waited. Didn't ask. Just waited, the way proud men do when asking feels like too much to give away. Jonah had understood that kind of pride, had cut off a hind quarter and handed it over without a word, because some things didn't need talking about. He hadn't thought about any of that since summer. He thought about it now. Standing over 6 sets of boot prints pointed straight at that ridge, and something cold moved through his stomach that had nothing to do with the wind coming down off the peaks. He told himself to ride home. His horse didn't move, which was foolish, since a horse doesn't have opinions about a man's moral obligations. But Jonah stood there a second longer anyway, like he was waiting for the animal to make the decision for him. Not my problem, he thought again. Except the thought didn't land right this time. Kept sliding off him like rain off a tin roof. Because somewhere under the part of him that had gone quiet and careful these last 3 years, there was still the part that remembered his father's voice. A man who watches evil happen and calls it none of his business that man's already halfway to being the evil himself. His father had said that once, about something else entirely, a cattle rustler, a hanging that went bad, a different valley, a different year. Jonah hadn't thought about those words in a long time. Hadn't needed to. There hadn't been much call for moral courage in the small, careful, fenced-in life he'd built for himself since Rachel died. He thought about them now. He mounted up. He didn't ride straight in. That would have been stupid, and stupid got men killed. He circled wide, came up along the dry wash, where the cottonwoods still had a little color left in them, and climbed the last stretch on foot, leading his horse, moving slow, the way his father had taught him to move when he was 9 years old, and being shown how to track for the first time. Slow is fast, his father used to say. Fast is how you end up dead. From the ridge, he could see the whole valley below. The Apache camp, maybe 30 lodges, cook fires smoking thin in the afternoon light, women down at the creek filling water skins, laughing about something he couldn't hear from this far off. Ordinary, peaceful, the kind of peaceful that made the 6 men crouched in the rocks 50 yards below him look even worse than they already did. Bounty hunters, had to be. He could see the rifles, could see the way they'd fanned out, low and patient, could see the man in the lead, checking something in his hand, a paper, maybe, or a small leather pouch, before tucking it back into his coat, watching the water, waiting for the moment the women were furthest from cover, furthest from the eyes of the camp. His stomach turned over, because he knew what happened to Apache women who got taken by men like that. Knew what the bounty posters said, Knew what the going rate was for a scalp or a captive delivered to the right buyer. Knew that the law out here had a way of looking sideways when the victims weren't the kind of people the law cared to protect. He should ride for help. Except there wasn't time, except the nearest help was 2 hours off. And these women had maybe 2 minutes. Except. He pulled the rifle from the scabbard. His hands weren't shaking. He noticed that. Filed it away for later. The way you file away small strange facts about yourself in the middle of doing something you never planned on doing. He fired once. High. A warning. Not a killing shot. He wasn't trying to murder anybody. Just trying to break the moment wide open before it closed on those women like a trap. It worked better than he expected. Chaos. The bounty hunters spun, rifles swinging up toward the ridge, toward him, and for one long stretched-out second, Jonah Marrow thought, well, that's probably going to get me killed. Then the camp erupted. Warriors pouring out from between the lodges, bows already drawn, and the women at the creek were running, not screaming, running with the water skins, still in their hands like instinct, told them not to leave anything behind that the enemy could use. One woman, dark hair pulled back tight, a knife already in her hand where a knife had no earthly business being, that fast turned and put herself between the bounty hunters and an older man, stumbling on the rocky bank, half turned away from the ambush, trying to shout the others toward cover. Jonah didn't know it yet, wouldn't know it for another hour, but that woman was Sanoa, and the older man she was shielding with her own body was Chief Tocho. It went bad fast, the way these do. The bounty hunters, cornered between the ridge and the camp, did what cornered men do. They started shooting anything that moved. Jonah came down off that slope faster than a smart man would have run it, rifle in one hand, the other out for a hostage he didn't really have, boots skidding on loose shale, and he watched helpless, still too far as Chief Tocho, trying to get his people back, trying to be seen, trying to be the calm center of something that had gone violently uncentered, took a bullet meant for somebody 20 feet to his left. Jonah saw him go down. Didn't think. Didn't plan it. His legs just moved, carrying him the rest of the way down that ridge, and he got to Tocho, seconds before a second shot would have finished what the first one started. Jonah put himself between the old man and the guns. Fired twice not to kill, though he'd have killed if it came to that, but to make noise and fear and confusion, because 6 armed men who suddenly weren't sure how many rifles they were up against tended to lose their nerve fast. They lost their nerve. Ran for the horses. One of them, scrambling backward, dropped something in the scrub, a small leather pouch, the same one Jonah had seen the lead man checking earlier, and didn't stop to retrieve it, too busy running for his life to worry about the payment he'd been promised for a job that had just gone spectacularly wrong. Left one of their own limping behind them, cursing, and even he didn't slow down enough to be caught. And then it was just Jonah, on his knees in the dirt, with an old man bleeding through his fingers and a whole camp of people staring at him like they couldn't decide whether he was a miracle or a threat. The woman with the knife reached them first. She didn't say thank you. Didn't say a thing at all. Just dropped down on the other side of Tocho, pressed her palm hard against the wound, and looked up at Jonah with an expression that could have stripped paint off a barn door. Move, she said. I'm trying to help. Move your hand. Wrong place. Flat. No patience in it at all. You want him dead. Keep pressing there. He moved his hand. She was right, of course. She was right about the wound, right about the pressure point, right about everything. And Jonah found himself just watching her. The steadiness of her hands. The scar that ran the length of her left forearm. Old and pale, an arrow wound healed a long time ago by somebody who knew what they were doing. The way she gave orders in short-clipped Apache to the men gathering around them, and they obeyed her without hesitation, like her voice carried weight that had nothing to do with being anybody's wife or daughter. She looked up once more, caught him staring. What, she said. Not really a question. Nothing, Jonah said, which was a lie, and they both knew it, and neither one of them had time to care. They got Tocho back to his lodge. The bullet had gone through the meat of his shoulder, missed anything that would have killed him outright, but he'd lost blood, and old men lost blood slower to replace than young ones. Jonah stood outside the lodge flap for a long while after, not sure if he was supposed to leave or stay, not sure what the etiquette was for a white rancher who'd just shot at bounty hunters on Apache land for reasons he still couldn't fully explain to himself. He decided to stay, at least until he knew the old man would live, which turned into a day. which turned into 3. He slept in the open near his horse because it didn't feel right to ask for a place inside the camp, and nobody offered one, not at first. He shared what ammunition he had, showed 2 of the younger men a game trail through the rocks to the east that most white men didn't know about an escape route, if it ever came to that again, and given what he'd just seen, it probably would. He didn't ask for anything in return, didn't expect anything either. He'd just been raised by that same father, that same voice that still lived somewhere behind his ribs, to believe a man did the right thing because it was right, not because it paid, which was, he'd think later, maybe the exact reason none of what happened next made any sense to him at all. Because he wasn't looking for a reward. He kept seeing her, the woman with the scar. Sanoa, he learned her name on the second day, from one of the boys who ran messages around camp, who said it like it was a small, dangerous secret. That's Sanoa. She fights like a man and talks like she's daring you to say something about it. Jonah hadn't said anything about it. He'd just watched her change the dressing on Tocho's shoulder with hands that didn't waste a single movement. Watched her stand at the edge of camp in the evenings, alone, looking north toward nothing in particular, like she was waiting for something that wasn't coming. She found him on the second afternoon, mending a torn strap on his saddle by the wash, and stood there a moment before saying anything, like she was deciding whether he was worth the effort of talking to. "You're still here," she said. "Old man's not out of the woods yet. He's stronger than he looks. A beat. So am I. In case that's next on your list of things to worry about." "Wasn't on the list, everything's on your list. I can see it. You've got the look of a man who worries about things whether they need worrying about or not." He glanced up at that, found something almost like humor in her face, quick and gone. That obvious. Painfully. He went back to tie the strap. "You always this friendly to men who just saved your chief's life? You didn't save him for me to be friendly about it." She crouched down across from him, watching his hands work. "You saved him because leaving him to die would have sat wrong with you. That's different from doing it for thanks." "Maybe I wanted the thanks." "No," she simply, like the matter was settled. "You didn't." He didn't have an answer for that, because she was right, and being read that clearly by a woman he'd known 2 days put a strange unfamiliar heat behind his collar that he chose to blame on the sun. "They call you hard," he said, before he could stop himself. "The boy who told me your name," said it like a warning. Something shuddered in her face, quick, there and gone, and for a second he thought he'd said the wrong thing entirely. "I've fought in raids since I was 16, she said. "Buried more of my own than most warriors twice my age. Turned down 3 offers of marriage because the men making them wanted a wife who'd stay in the lodge and be quiet, and I have never in my life been quiet, and I am done pretending I might learn how." A short, humorless laugh. "So, hard. Yes, I've heard the word. I've stopped minding it. I don't think it's the insult they mean it as." She looked at him then, really looked, like she was recalculating something. "You don't know me well enough to have an opinion about that." "Maybe not." He tied off the strap at the saddle aside. "But I know what it costs a person to keep standing up straight, when everybody around them keeps telling them to sit down and be smaller. Take something. You said that yourself, at the creek, about what I did." He met her eyes. "Same rule applies to you, seems to me." She didn't answer right away. When she did, her voice had lost some of its edge. "You talk more than I expected." "Don't usually. You're easy to talk to." "Didn't expect that either." "Careful," she said, standing, brushing dust from her knees. "Keep talking like that, and people will start telling stories. Let them." She was already walking away, but he saw the corner of her mouth twitch before she turned, and he sat there by the wash a long while after, wondering what exactly had just happened to 3 years of careful, deliberate silence. She came to find him again the next morning. Not by accident, though, she didn't say so. Just appeared at the edge of the wash while he was checking his horse's shoe, a bow slung across her back and a look on her face that said she'd already decided he was coming with her whether he agreed to it or not. "There's a cat been taking goats from the herd 2 ridges over," she said. "Old Tom, big enough to be worth the trouble of finding him before he gets bolder." "I'm going. You're coming." "Didn't know I'd volunteered." "You didn't. I'm telling you." A pause and something almost playful crept into her voice, quick and gone the way her humor always was, like she wasn't entirely sure she was allowed to have it. "Unless the man who shot at 6 armed bounty hunters is suddenly afraid of 1 mountain lion." Wasn't afraid of the bounty hunters either. Didn't have time to be. Excuses, she was already walking. Bring your rifle. He brought his rifle. They tracked the cat for the better part of 2 hours, up through the rocks where the goats had scattered, and Jonah found himself somewhere in that stretch of quiet climbing, doing something he hadn't done in 3 years, paying attention to somebody else's rhythm instead of just his own. She moved like the land belonged to her, low and unhurried, reading sign he'd have walked straight past a bent stem here, a single hair caught on brush there, and calling it out to him in a low voice, without once making him feel foolish for missing it. You're better at this than most men I've hunted with, she said, crouched over a print pressed fresh into soft dirt. High praise. Don't let it go to your head. Too late. She almost smiled at that. Almost. He was starting to catalog the almost smiles the way another man might catalog rare birds, small, quick, gone before you could be sure you'd seen them at all, and worth watching for regardless. They found the cat's den an hour later, empty, the animal long since moved on, and Jonah half suspected she'd known that from the start, that the hunt had been less about the cat and more about something else neither one of them was ready to name out loud. They sat a while on a flat rock overlooking the valley, sharing water from his canteen, not talking much, and the silence between them was nothing at all like the silence he lived in back at the ranch. That silence had weight. This one had room to breathe in. You lost your wife, she said finally. Not a question, just a fact she'd clearly been holding on to since the day he arrived. 3 years back. And you never remarried. Never courted anyone in your own town. Didn't want to. He turned the canteen over in his hands. Didn't feel right. Moving on like she was a fence post that needed replacing. Some men do it different. I couldn't. She was quiet a moment, looking out over the valley, the wind pulling a few loose strands of hair across her face that she didn't bother pushing back. I understand that better than you'd think, she said. Not the same loss, but the same refusing. I've had 3 offers of marriage. Turned all 3 down, because every one of those men wanted a wife who'd stop being who I am the moment she stepped into his lodge, and I would rather stand alone the rest of my life than shrink myself down to fit somebody else's idea of small. Nobody's asking you to shrink, Jonah said, not from where I'm sitting. She looked at him then, sharp and searching, like she was checking the words for a hidden edge and not finding one. We'll see, she said. You haven't had to live with me yet. Looking forward to finding out. The words were out of his mouth before he'd fully decided to say them, and for one suspended second he wondered if he'd overstepped, except she laughed. Short and surprised. A real laugh. The first he'd heard out of her, and something in his chest loosened that had been clenched tight for 3 solid years. Careful, rancher, she said, standing, slinging her bow back over her shoulder. Keep talking like that and I might start to like you. Would that be so terrible? Ask me again in a week. But she was still almost smiling as she said it, and Jonah rode back down off that ridge, feeling lighter than he had any right to feel, given everything hanging over the next 2 days. Not everyone in camp watched the 2 of them with easy eyes. There was a young warrior Jonah had noticed him before, without paying much attention, the way you notice a hawk circling without thinking much about what it's hunting. Broad through the shoulders, quick with a bow, a little too quick with a scowl whenever Sanoa's name came up in conversation near him. One evening, Jonah caught the man watching Sanoa across the fire, with an expression that had nothing friendly in it at all, not quite hatred, not quite grief, something tangled up between the 2. He asked one of the boys about it. Careful, casuals. That's Isha, the boy said. Wanted Sanoa for a wife 2 winters back. She said no. A shrug. The particular shrug of a child repeating gossip he doesn't fully understand the weight of. He didn't take it well, still doesn't. Jonah filed that away too. Didn't think much of it at the time. A rejected suitor sulking by a fire was hardly the strangest thing he'd seen in 3 days that had already turned his whole understanding of his own life upside down. He had no way of knowing, not yet, just how much that particular grudge would come to matter before this was over. On the 3rd evening, Chief Tocho's voice stopped him at the edge of camp, where Jonah had been quietly saddling his horse in the dark, telling himself it was time to head home, that he'd done what needed doing, and had no business lingering any longer than that. You would leave without a word? Jonah turned. The old man was sitting up outside his lodge, wrapped in a blanket, his shoulder bound tight, watching Jonah with eyes that missed very little. Didn't want to be a bother, Jonah said. You're healing. Your people don't need a white man underfoot while they're deciding what to do about me. Deciding what to do about you. Tocho almost laughed. It turned into a wince halfway through. You think we are deciding whether to punish you? Something like that. No. The old man shook his head slowly. We are deciding how to honor you. There is a difference. A large one. I don't need honoring. I need to get back to my cattle. Your cattle will still be cattle in 3 more days. A pause, and something shifted in the old man's face, something gentler. Something that looked almost like grief wearing the shape of kindness. Sit down, Jonah Marrow. Let an old man talk a while. It is the least you owe me, since you would not let me die. Jonah sat. Tocho studied him a long moment across the low flames, head tilted slightly, the way a man studies something he's trying to place. Marrow, he said, turning the name over slow. Your father worked this valley too, did he not? Before you. Built the ranch from nothing. Died when I was 22. Jonah frowned slightly. You knew him? I knew of him, Tocho said. And something careful passed behind the old man's eyes, there and folded away again before Jonah could read it clearly. A long time ago. Different times. We will speak of it another day, perhaps, when there is less pressing on both our houses than there is tonight. He waved a hand, as if brushing the thought aside, though Jonah noticed he didn't quite manage to brush it all the way clear of his own face. Tonight there are other matters. Jonah let it go, though the words sat strange and unfinished in his chest, a door left open just a crack that he didn't yet have the time or the reason to push through. You did not ask for payment, Tocho said, once Jonah had settled across the small fire from him. That is exactly why one must be given. Among my people, a debt refused becomes a debt doubled. It sits on both houses until it is answered. You saved more than an old man's life at that creek, Jonah Marrow. You saved something we have been losing a long time now, the belief that not every white man in this territory wants us dead or gone, or bent small enough to disappear quietly. That belief is worth more than you understand. It deserves to be answered with something that costs. Not words. Words are cheap out here. They always have been. I don't want anything costly from you. I know. Tocho's eyes glinted, faint and knowing, in the firelight. That is precisely why you will receive it. The council met the next morning. Jonah wasn't invited inside the circle, but he heard the shape of it from a distance, elders' voices. Low, mostly in Apache. A little English threaded through here and there, enough for him to catch pieces. Debt. He understood that word however it came dressed. What is owed? What the man is owed for the chief's life. He heard one voice, sharp young, and he'd have bet money it belonged to Isha, arguing something with more heat than the others. Couldn't make out the words. Didn't need to. He could guess well enough what a rejected suitor might have to say about handing a woman like Sanoa over to a stranger, however deserving that stranger claimed to be. He didn't like being talked about like a bill that needed settling, whichever way the argument went. He'd done what he did because it needed doing, not because he was fishing for payment, and the idea that his one decent act out here was being weighed and measured against some kind of return made something in him go tight and uncomfortable. He was still turning that discomfort over in his mind the night before the ceremony, sitting alone by a small fire at the edge of camp, when Sanoa sat down across from him without asking permission, the way she seemed to do most things. You look like a man walking to his own hanging, she said. Feel a little like one. They haven't decided anything yet. Not for certain. Haven't they? He poked at the fire with a stick, watched the sparks lift and scatter. Feels decided. Feels like the whole valley's already written the ending, and I'm just the last one to hear it read out loud. She was quiet a moment. Would it be so terrible? Whatever they decide, don't rightly know. He looked up at her. Would it be terrible for you? Something flickered across her face, guarded, quick, gone before he could name it. I stopped expecting anything good from ceremonies a long time ago. Easier that way. Nothing left to be disappointed about. That's a hard way to live, you'd know. A small, humorless smile. Both of us building fences around ourselves so nothing else gets in to hurt us. Yours made of grief. Mine made of I don't know. Being told too many times what I'm supposed to want. What do you want? The question hung there a moment, longer than he meant it to. She looked at the fire instead of at him. I want a matter for something other than being useful, she said finally, quiet. I fight well. I heal well. I track well. Everyone wants what I can do. Nobody's ever much cared about who I am underneath the doing of it. She glanced up, and there was something almost daring in the look, like she expected him to flinch from it. You're the first man in longer than I can remember who's looked at me, like I might be more than a list of skills. You are, Jonah said, simple, unhesitating. Plainest thing I've seen in 3 years. She didn't answer that. Just watched him a long moment across the low fire, something unguarded moving behind her eyes, before she caught it and put it away again. And when she finally spoke, her voice had gone soft in a way he hadn't heard from her yet. Whatever happens tomorrow, she said, I want you to know I don't blame you for any of it. Not the ceremony. Not the debt. None of it was yours to ask for, wasn't yours either. No. She stood, brushing dust from her knees, pausing a moment longer than she needed to before she turned to go. Get some sleep, Jonah Marrow. Tomorrow's going to be a long day, whichever way it falls. He watched her walk back toward the fires at the center of camp and sat a long while after she'd gone, staring into the coals, thinking that whatever tomorrow held, he was no longer entirely sure he wanted to ride away from it, even if he still could. He was still turning that discomfort over in his mind the following morning, the morning of the ceremony, when he understood at last exactly what shape that debt was going to take, and by then, it was far too late to ride away from any of it. There was something else, too. Something that had been sitting quiet in the back of Jonah's mind since that first conversation by the wash, growing louder the longer he stayed. 3 years back, the fever. He hadn't thought of it in specific pieces for a long time. Mostly he kept it as one solid wall of grief, undifferentiated, easier to carry that way than in pieces sharp enough to cut. But something about this camp, about the smell of wood smoke and crushed sage, about a woman with steady hands and a scar on her arm, kept dragging pieces of that wall loose. He remembered Rachel's voice going hoarse from coughing, remembered the doctor in Willow Bend, a decent enough man, but out of his depth admitting as much in a low voice on the porch, while Jonah stood there, feeling the ground go soft beneath him. Remembered 3 days and 3 nights of cold cloths and broth she couldn't keep down, and prayers he didn't fully believe in anymore, offered anyway, because a drowning man doesn't stop to argue theology. He remembered the 4th night most of all, the way the lamp had burned low and he hadn't gotten up to trim the wick because getting up meant letting go of her hand, and he wasn't ready, would never have been ready, no matter how many more nights he'd been given. She'd opened her eyes once, near the end, clearer than they'd been in days, and looked at him with something that wasn't fear at all, something closer to apology, like she was sorry for the trouble of it, sorry for leaving him with a house too big and a silence too wide, and he'd told her to hush, told her there wasn't a thing in this world she owed him an apology for, and she'd smiled anyway, small and tired, and closed her eyes, and that had been that. He didn't remember much of the days after. Didn't remember digging the grave, though his hands had blistered doing it, so he must have. Didn't remember the sermon, though people told him later it had been a fine one. What he remembered was the specific useless thought that kept circling back through the fog of it all, that somewhere out there, in that same stretch of days, somebody might have had the thing that could have saved her, and the town he'd lived in his whole life had turned that somebody away at the point of a rifle before they ever got close enough to try. He'd let that thought go, eventually. Had to. A man couldn't carry every unanswerable question and still get up every morning to feed cattle that didn't care what he believed in. He'd folded it up small and put it away with the rest of the grief, in that same sealed room behind his ribs where he kept everything too heavy to look at directly. He hadn't expected the room to come open again. Not here. Not now. Not because of a scar on a stranger's arm. And he remembered vaguely at the edges, the way you remember things you were too underwater to pay attention to at the time, someone mentioning riders. Some Indians came through trying to sell snake oil during the sickness. Boys ran them off. He'd nodded at the time. Hadn't asked a single question. Had been too far inside his own grief to wonder what those riders had actually wanted, or whether snake oil was the truth or just the easiest lie a frightened town could tell itself. He hadn't thought about it again. Not once, not in 3 years. Until a woman with a scar on her arm told him, 3 days into a ceremony he never asked for, that she'd ridden 2 days with willow bark and feverfew and been turned back at gunpoint before she ever reached whatever door needed reaching. He didn't know yet, standing there at the edge of the council fire, that the timing would line up so precisely it would feel less like coincidence and more like a debt the whole valley owed, coming due all at once. He'd learn that soon enough. The morning of the ceremony came in gray and still, the kind of stillness that felt like the whole valley was holding its breath. No wind, no birdsong, just the low murmur of a camp gathering itself into something formal, something old, Something Jonah didn't have the words or the history to fully understand, no matter how many times Tocho tried to explain it to him the night before. He'd lain awake a long while in the dark, staring up at nothing, running through every reason this was a mistake and finding each time that the reasons all led back to the same place: a scar on a forearm, a story about willow bark and feverfew, a debt that had nothing to do with the one the council thought they were settling. Which was maybe why, when he finally rose before dawn and walked down to the creek to splash cold water on his face, his hands weren't quite steady. Not fear exactly. Something closer to standing at the edge of a cliff in the dark, unable to see the bottom, and being asked to jump anyway on nothing but faith that the landing would hold. Word had traveled, the way word always does out here, faster than any man could ride. A handful of white settlers had shown up at the edge of camp, cattle buyers mostly, men who did business with both sides of the valley, and figured this was worth the ride to witness, plus one or two who'd simply heard there might be a spectacle worth telling stories about later, over whiskey, in whatever saloon would listen. Jonah recognized two of them. Didn't like that they were there, didn't have a say in it either. He stood where he was told to stand, near the center of the gathering, close enough to the fire pit that had been dug and filled with fresh coals for the occasion, that he could feel the heat of it against his shins, even through his boots. He wore the only clean shirt he had left in his saddlebag. Felt, for the first time in 3 years, like every eye in 100 miles was fixed on him at once, and none of that quiet, careful distance he'd built up was doing him one bit of good. 2 women were brought forward. The first was Mava, 22 years old, the chief's daughter, and even Jonah, half numb with dread by that point, could see why half the camp assumed this was already decided. She wore a dress the color of turned earth, beaded at the collar and hem with more care than anyone spends on an ordinary morning. Her hair was oiled and braided, a small string of trade beads woven through it, catching the gray light every time she turned her head. She was beautiful in the plain, undeniable way that makes people stop talking when someone walks past. She kept her eyes down, kept her hands folded in front of her, the picture of everything a young woman was supposed to be, in any language, in any camp, in any town Jonah had ever passed through. The second was Sanoa. She wore what she'd worn every day since he'd met her. No beads, no oil in her hair, which was pulled back the same severe, practical way it always was. She stood with her weight even on both feet, the way a person stands when they've spent a life ready to move fast if they have to. The scar on her forearm was in plain view, and if it bothered her to have it seen, she gave no sign of it. She didn't look down. She looked straight ahead, chin level, like she'd already decided this whole ceremony was a formality that had nothing to do with her, and she was only standing here because refusing would cause more trouble than enduring it. Jonah's chest did something strange when he looked at her, something he didn't have a name for yet. Chief Tocho stood between the 2 women, his arms still bound, but his voice carrying clear across the gathered crowd. He spoke first in Apache, long, formal, the kind of cadence a man only uses for words that have been used the same way for 100 years before him, and then for the benefit of the white men watching, or maybe just for Jonah, in slow, careful English. This man saved my life, and in doing so, he honored my people more than he knows. Tocho's eyes moved over the crowd, then settled on Jonah. It is our way in a debt of this size to offer the highest gift a family can give, not land, not horses, a daughter of this people, to be his wife under our law, and through her a bond between his house and ours that neither hunger nor bounty hunters, nor the government at San Carlos, can break so easily as they might break a promise written only on paper. A murmur through the crowd. Jonah felt it more than heard it, a current running through everyone gathered, and every single thread of that current was pointed the same direction, toward Mava, toward the obvious choice, the pretty choice, the choice that made sense to everybody watching, the choice that would let this whole strange, unprecedented morning resolve itself the way everyone had already quietly decided it would. He could feel Isha's eyes on him from somewhere near the back of the crowd, could feel the heat of that stare even without turning to find it. Tocho continued, Jonah Marrow, you will choose, and whichever woman you choose, she goes with you as your wife under our law and our protection, and you take on the protection of her people in return. Jonah looked at Mava first, because it was expected, because his eyes were supposed to land there and stay. They didn't stay. They moved to Sanoa, and something happened in that moment that Jonah would spend the rest of his life trying to explain. and never quite manage a flash, sudden and disorienting, like a hand reaching backward through 3 years and yanking a memory loose that he'd buried so deep he'd forgotten it was even there. The scar on her arm, he'd heard about a scar like it before. Not here. Not this week. 3 years ago. On the porch of his own house, in the worst week of his life, when the fever was tearing through Rachel and there was nothing any doctor in 50 miles could do about it. 3 years ago, when 2 riders had come from the direction of the Apache camps, one older, one younger, carrying herbs and a knowledge of fevers that the town doctor didn't have and wouldn't have admitted needing even if his life depended on it. 3 years ago, when the men of Willow Bend had ridden out to turn those 2 riders back at gunpoint before they ever reached his gate, because fear made men do ugly things, and the fever had everyone in that town afraid enough to turn away help wearing the wrong face. He'd been inside, hadn't seen it happen, had only heard about it after heard it secondhand, distorted, dismissed as some Indians trying to cause trouble during the sickness, and he'd been too deep in his own grief at the time to ask a single question about who those riders had actually been, or what they'd actually been trying to do. He was asking now, 3 years too late, and the answer was standing 20 feet in front of him, chin up, refusing to look away. He didn't know it for certain. Not yet. Not with the kind of certainty a man needs before he says something that can't be unsaid, but something in his chest had gone cold and roaring at once, and he understood, with a clarity that frightened him, that this was not a stranger standing across from him. This was somebody who had already once tried to save his family, and failed, because his own people wouldn't let her close enough to try. The silence stretched. Too long. Long enough that Tocho glanced at him, a small frown of concern crossing the old man's weathered face, wondering if the shock of the whole ceremony had simply frozen the white rancher solid. Say something. Jonah's own thoughts came at him jagged, out of order, tripping over each other. Anybody. Anything. Except your mouth won't open because your mind is 3 years gone and 40 miles east, back on a porch that doesn't exist anymore except in the worst room of your memory, which was insane. Which made no sense. Except it made all the sense in the world, and that was the terrifying part. Breathe. Just breathe. She's looking at you like you've gone simple. Maybe you have. Jonah wasn't frozen. He was somewhere 3 years in the past, standing on a porch he could still feel under his boots if he closed his eyes. Listening to Rachel cough in a room he couldn't fix and couldn't save and couldn't do one single thing about, and somewhere out past the edge of that memory, 2 riders were being turned back at gunpoint by men who thought they were protecting the town. He came back to the present slowly, like surfacing from deep water. Maeva was still watching him with polite, patient eyes, the way a person watches an outcome they've already accepted. Senoa was watching him too differently, sharper, like she'd noticed something crack across his face in that long silence, and couldn't quite work out what it was. Everybody was waiting. Jonah looked at Tocho. 3 years ago, he said, and his own voice sounded strange to him, rough at the edges. There was a sickness in Willow Bend. Bad fever. It took my wife. Took our child before it was even born. He heard the crowd stir at that, heard the murmur shift from anticipation to something more careful, more uncertain. He kept going. Because if he stopped now, he wasn't sure he'd find the nerve to finish. I was told after that 2 riders came from your camp during that sickness. Came with herbs. Came to help. And the men of my town turned them back with guns before they ever got close enough to try. He looked at Senoa. Was one of those riders you? The crowd had gone entirely silent now. Even the settlers at the edge of the gathering had stopped their low muttering to one another, sensing the way people always sense, even when they don't understand the words, that something enormous was happening in front of them. Senoa didn't answer right away. When she finally did, her voice was quieter than Jonah had heard it yet. Quieter and rawer. My father and I rode 2 days, she said. We had willow bark, feverfew, things that might have helped, might not have. Nobody can promise a fever will listen to medicine. But we rode anyway. Because a rider passed through our camp saying, the sickness in Willow Bend was killing people faster than anybody could bury them, and my father said no person deserved to die, simply because the ones who could help were afraid of what he looked like. Her jaw tightened. We got within sight of the town. 3 men rode out, told us to turn around or be shot for trespassing. My father tried to explain. They fired a warning shot into the ground in front of his horse. A long pause. We turned around. We had no choice. I have carried that turning around for 3 years, Jonah Marrow. I did not know until this moment whose door we failed to reach. Jonah stood there, felt something break open in his chest that had been sealed shut since the day he buried Rachel under that cottonwood tree. You didn't fail, he said, and his voice cracked on the word, and he didn't care who heard it crack. The men who turned you away failed. You rode 2 days to try and save people you'd never even met. That's not failure. That's about the bravest thing I've ever heard of in my life. Nobody in that crowd moved. Nobody breathed too loud. Tocho, watching all of this with the sharp stillness of a man who understood exactly what he was witnessing, finally spoke, gentle now, none of the ceremony's formality left in his voice. Jonah Marrow, you must choose. The debt still stands, whatever ghosts have walked into this circle today. Jonah looked at Maeva once more, saw the same patient, gracious calm on her face, and saw, too, if he looked closely enough, the faintest flicker of relief, though he couldn't have said why, not yet, not with everything else crowding his mind in that moment. Then he looked at Sanoa, really looked, not at the scar, not at the story that had just cracked his whole careful world down the middle, but at her steady unflinching, chin still up even now, even with 3 years of guilt, and an entire crowd's expectations bearing down on her at once. I'm not choosing the prettiest woman standing here, he said, loud enough for the whole gathering to hear, loud enough that the settlers at the edge of the crowd would carry these exact words back to town by nightfall, whether he liked it or not. And I'm not choosing out of pity, and I'm not choosing because of what I just learned about 3 years ago, though God knows that's shaken something loose in me I don't have words for yet. He took a breath, thought for just a flicker of a second, of his father, of that same voice that had dragged him off his own ranch 3 days ago and put him on this ridge in the first place. A man who watches evil happen and calls it none of his business. His father had never lived to meet a woman like this one. Would have liked her anyway. Jonah was certain of that, suddenly, with a certainty that steadied him more than he expected. I'm choosing the woman who rode 2 days to save strangers, and the woman who put her own body between a knife and an old man 3 days ago without a second's hesitation, and the woman who's stood in front of this whole camp today with more courage than most men I've ever known. He looked straight at her. I choose Sanoa. The silence broke into something loud and startled and murmuring, all at once gasps from some, low, urgent whispers from others, one of the settlers at the edge of the crowd actually taking a step backward like the words had physically struck him. An old woman near the front pressed a hand to her mouth. A cluster of younger warriors exchanged glances that mixed disbelief with something that looked almost like admiration, like they hadn't expected a white man to have that particular kind of nerve. Chief Tocho's face, for just a moment, betrayed something raw beneath the ceremony's formal calm grief and gratitude tangled together, the look of a man who understood, better than anyone gathered there, exactly how much this single choice had just cost, and repaid all at once. Somewhere behind the crowd, Isha turned and walked away from the gathering without a word to anyone, his shoulders set hard and tight, and nobody stopped him. Jonah caught the look on the young warrior's face, just before he turned not simple anger, but something closer to humiliation, the particular sting of watching a thing you believe belonged to you by right slip away in front of the entire world, handed instead to a man from outside, a stranger who hadn't even had to fight for it the way tradition said a man should. Jonah didn't think much of that look in the moment. He would think of it a great deal, later when it mattered a good deal more than it did right now. Sanoa didn't move, didn't smile, didn't do anything for one long unbearable second, except stare at Jonah like she was trying to work out whether this was some kind of cruel trick her own exhausted mind was playing on her. Then very slowly, she nodded. Once. It wasn't romance. Not yet. It wasn't a fairy tale ending. And both of them seemed to understand that in the same instant this was a debt, a bond, a beginning built on grief and guilt, and a story neither one of them had asked to be part of. But it was something. A door cracking open, where there'd only been a locked, silent house for 3 long years. Chief Tocho closed, his eyes briefly, murmured something in Apache that sounded like a blessing, or maybe a prayer of relief, that the whole terrifying, unpredictable ceremony had reached its end without disaster. Maeva stepped forward before the crowd fully broke apart, crossing the small distance between herself and Sanoa, and for one uncertain second Jonah wasn't sure what he was about to witness, some final objection, some old rivalry finally allowed to surface now that the outcome was settled. Instead, Maeva took both of Sanoa's hands in her own, quiet, and said something low in Apache that made Sanoa's careful composure crack, just slightly, just for a moment. What did she say? Jonah asked later when he finally had the nerve. Sanoa was a long time answering. She said she's glad it was me, that she never wanted this, not the ceremony, not the choosing, not being looked at like a prize on a shelf. She said her heart has belonged somewhere else for a long time now, somewhere her father doesn't know about yet, and today she got to stand beside me and watch someone else carry a weight she never wanted to carry herself. A small, unguarded breath. I didn't expect that. I spent 3 days certain she resented me for even being considered against her. Turns out I had it backward the whole time. People usually do, Jonah said. Have things backward. Is that supposed to be wisdom? It's supposed to be the truth. Wisdom's extra if you want it. She almost smiled at that, the real kind. The kind he was starting to recognize, even in the low light of a gray, unsteady afternoon, and for a moment, neither one of them said anything at all, just stood there together at the edge of a camp that had, in the space of one strange morning, rearranged the entire shape of both their lives. Later, when the fires had been banked low and most of the camp had drifted back to their own lodges, Jonah found her sitting alone near the creek where they'd first met 3 days before, knees drawn up, watching the water move in the dark. "Room for one more?" he asked. "Depends on the company." Fair enough. He sat anyway, a careful distance away, close enough to talk, far enough not to crowd. Strange day. Strangest of my life, she said. And I've lived through raids and burying and every kind of trouble this territory knows how to hand a person a pause. I keep waiting to feel afraid of this. Of you. Of tomorrow. It hasn't come yet. Maybe it won't. Maybe. She turned to look at him, the moonlight catching the edge of that old scar along her arm. And for the first time since he'd met her, there was nothing guarded in her expression at all, just something quiet and searching and unafraid. I don't know how to be someone's wife, Jonah Marrow. Never learned it. Never wanted to, not the way they teach it. I know how to fight, how to track, how to keep people alive when the world's trying hard to do the opposite. Good, he said. Because I don't need a wife who knows how to sit quiet and look pretty. Had that life once, in a manner of speaking, and losing it near about broke me clean in half. I need somebody who can stand next to me when the ground shifts. Something tells me that's exactly what you are. She didn't answer right away. When she did, her voice had gone low, almost unsteady, in a way he suspected cost her something to allow. Then we'll learn the rest of it together, she said. Whatever the rest of it turns out to be. They sat there a long while after that, not touching, not needing to, just two people who'd each spent years building walls around the softest parts of themselves, sitting close enough in the dark to feel the walls beginning, slowly, to come down. Neither Jonah nor Sanoa noticed the settler who left first. He was one of the cattle buyers, a thin man named Purdy, who did occasional business hauling stock for the bank in Willow Bend, and who had ridden out that morning purely for the spectacle of it, the way a man rides out for a hanging or a horse race, expecting a story and nothing more. What he'd witnessed instead was a story worth more than any horse race, and he knew it the moment Jonah said her name, knew it the way a man knows when he's holding something valuable in his hands. He turned his horse before the crowd had even finished murmuring and rode hard for town, already composing in his head exactly how he was going to tell it. He didn't ride to the saloon first. He rode straight past it, past the general store, past the little whitewashed church that never had much of a congregation, straight to the 2-story brick building at the end of Main Street, with Willow Bend Territorial Bank painted in gold letters across the front window. Sterling Whitfield was at his desk when Purdy came through the door without knocking, out of breath, hat still on. "You're going to want to hear this," Purdy said. Whitfield set down his pen. He was a neat, unhurried sort of man, the kind who never seemed to sweat even in August, with soft hands that had never done a real day's work and a way of looking at a person like he was already calculating what that person was worth. "I'm listening. Marrow. Jonah Marrow. Out at Shadow Creek." Purdy dropped into the chair across the desk, still catching his breath. There was some kind of trouble out at the Apache camp on the ridge. Bounty men, from the look of it, tried to take some of their women at the creek. Marrow rode in, ran them off, saved the old chief's life. Whitfield's expression didn't change, not even slightly. "Go on." "They had a ceremony this morning, some kind of Indian custom paying him back for saving the chief. Offered him a wife, 2 of them to choose from." Purdy shook his head. still half in disbelief at his own story. He picked the fighter, the scarred one, picked her right over the chief's own daughter, in front of God and everybody, and gave some speech about it that had half that camp in tears. For a long moment, Sterling Whitfield said nothing at all. He simply leaned back in his chair, laced his soft fingers together over his waistcoat, and allowed something close to a smile to settle over his face, thin, private, entirely without warmth. Because Sterling Whitfield already knew about the bounty men at the creek, knew a great deal more about them than Purdy or anyone else in Willow Bend had any reason to suspect. He'd hired them himself, 3 days earlier, through a man in Tucson who didn't ask questions and didn't leave paper trails, paid half up front and half on delivery, for a job that had nothing to do with bounties at all, and everything to do with the survey map, rolled up in the bottom drawer of his desk, a map showing a proposed line for the Southern Pacific Spur, cutting straight through Apache land that would be worth 10 times its current value the moment the railroad company came, looking to buy a right-of-way, provided the Apache band camped on it could be persuaded, or frightened, or simply removed before anyone in Tucson thought to ask who currently held the claim. Frightening the camp into scattering had seemed, 3 days ago, like a clean and simple plan. It had not gone the way he'd planned, Merrill Whitfield said slowly, turning the name over like a man testing the weight of a coin. That's the ranch that sits square between the camp and the old stage road, isn't it? That's the one. And now he's tied himself by their own law, in front of witnesses. Whitfield's soft smile didn't waver, though something colder moved behind his eyes, a man recalculating a plan that had just become considerably more complicated and considerably more interesting. Well then, that is unfortunate for Mr. Merrow. A rancher married outside recognized law, living openly with an Apache woman on contested land, standing between me and a railroad line worth a great deal of money to a great many powerful men. He picked his pen back up, dipped it, and began, unhurried, to write. I imagine Willow Bend is about to develop some very strong opinions about its neighbors out at Shadow Creek. Sheriff Garrick came through the door before Purdy could answer, drawn by the sound of raised voices from the street, and stopped just inside the threshold, hat in hand, taking in the scene. Purdy flushed and talking too fast. Whitfield, calm as still water behind his desk, heard some commotion about Merrow. Garrick said, careful. The way a man is careful when he already suspects he isn't going to like what he hears next. Somebody said he's gone and married himself an Apache woman. Word travels fast, Whitfield said, pleasant as ever. Word travels fast in this town, because you make sure it does. Garrick's eyes moved between the two of them, and something tightened at the corner of his jaw. He was a heavy-set man, going gray, with the tired look of a lawman who'd spent 20 years enforcing rules he didn't always agree with because disagreeing had never once put food on his table. What exactly is it you're planning to do with this, Sterling? Nothing that isn't already within the letter of the law. Whitfield folded his hands. A man living openly with a woman outside any marriage this territory recognizes, on land whose title, I might add, could stand a closer look, given how long it's been since anyone last surveyed that eastern boundary line properly. He let that sit a moment, watching Garrick's face for the reaction he clearly expected. I'd think a sheriff sworn to uphold territorial law would want to look into all of that, wouldn't you say? Garrick didn't answer right away. There was history behind his silence, though neither Purdy nor Whitfield could have named it an old debt of his own, a favor from Whitfield's bank that had kept Garrick's brother's failing store afloat 2 winters back, a debt that had never once been called due in so many words, but sat there anyway, understood by both men, the way these things always were in a town small enough that everyone owed somebody something. I'll look into it, Garrick said, finally low. And something in his voice suggested the words cost him more than they should have. Proper. By the book. Nothing more than that. That's all I'd ever ask of you, Whitfield said, already turning back to his papers, already finished with the conversation as far as he was concerned. By the book, Sheriff. I have every confidence the book will say exactly what needs saying. Garrick left without another word, settling his hat back on his head at the door, and if either man in that office had looked closely enough, they might have noticed the particular way his hand trembled briefly before he stepped back out onto the street, the small, private tremor of a man who suspected, even then, on this very first afternoon, that he had just agreed to something he was going to regret. Purdy shifted in his chair, some vague unease crossing his face, The look of a man who said more than he meant to and isn't entirely sure what he's just set in motion. You want me to spread it around town? What? I saw. Spread it everywhere, Whitfield said, without looking up from his writing. Every saloon, every church pew, every dinner table between here and the county line. Let them talk, Mr. Purdy. Let them talk until there isn't a soul in this territory who doesn't have an opinion about Jonah Merrow and the Indian wife he chose over decent company. He set the pen down at last and looked up, and his eyes had gone flat and businesslike in a way that made Purdy suddenly wish he'd kept his news to the saloon after all. A man that isolated, that exposed, that easy to paint as an outlaw in his own valley. He almost laughed. He's just made my work a great deal simpler than I had any right to expect. Outside the bank window, the town of Willow Bend went on about its ordinary afternoon business, entirely unaware that somewhere out past the ridge, a rancher and a warrior had just stepped, hand in hand and eyes wide open, into the middle of a fight neither one of them yet knew they were in. The first morning Sanoa woke up at Shadow Creek, she didn't know where she was. Not for a full breath. Maybe two. That gap between sleep and waking where a body forgets, mercifully, everything that's changed, and then the ceiling came into focus. Low beams instead of a lodge's curved poles, and it all came rushing back at once. The ceremony, the choosing, the ride home in silence, because neither one of them had known what to say, and saying nothing had felt safer than saying the wrong thing. She lay still a moment, listened. Boots on the porch outside, a door easing shut, careful like someone trying not to wake her. The clink of a coffee pot going onto a stove. He'd given her the second room, hadn't touched her. Hadn't asked for anything at all, actually. Beyond a quiet, "This is yours if you want it," the night before. Gesturing at a narrow bed, with a quilt folded at the foot, and then he'd gone to his own room and shut the door, and that had been that. She didn't know what to make of that kind of restraint. Wasn't sure yet if it was respect or simply a man too grief-shy to reach for anything, even a wife handed to him by ceremony and debt. She supposed she'd find out. Everything out here was going to be a matter of finding out, one uncertain day at a time. She got up, got dressed, went to find him. He was at the stove when she came out, back to her, coffee already going, and he startled, actually startled, shoulders jumping when he turned and found her standing in the doorway. "Didn't hear you," he said. "I know how to move quiet. Comes with the fighting." She looked around the kitchen, small spare, a single chair pulled up to a table built for two. Her eyes caught on an empty glass jar sitting on the windowsill. Dust settled thick inside it, the kind of dust that only gathers over years of being left exactly where it was set down. "That yours?" She nodded at it. Something crossed his face quick, and he turned back to the stove before answering. "Was Rachel's. Kept flowers in it. You want me to move it?" "No." Too fast. He heard himself say it too fast and softened it. "No, leave it be. It's not, it doesn't need to go anywhere on my account." She didn't push. Filed it away instead, the way she filed away most things about this quiet, careful man. Small facts collected patiently, the way a person builds a map of unfamiliar country one landmark at a time. "Coffee?" he offered. "Please." He poured, handed it over. Their fingers brushed at the exchange and both of them pretended not to notice, with the particular studied carelessness of two people, equally determined not to make anything of it. "There's work today," he said. "Fence still needs finishing from the storm, and I ought to move the herd down off the ridge before the weather turns again. I can help with both." "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to." She set the coffee down, met his eyes steady. "I want to. It come here to sit in a house and wait for you to decide what I'm allowed to do with my hands, Jonah Merrow. That's not who I am. I told you that already." Something in his face eased, like he'd been braced for a different answer and was relieved not to have gotten it. "Didn't figure you for the sitting type. You figured right." They finished the coffee mostly in silence after that, but it was a different silence than the one from the ride-home lighter. Somehow, like the first thin crack of light under a door that had been shut a long, long time. They rode the fence line together that morning, and Jonah found himself, more than once, simply watching her work the economy of her movements, the way she read the land without seeming to think about it at all, the way she'd catch him watching and arch one eyebrow at him without breaking stride on whatever she was doing. "You do that a lot," she said around mid-morning, tamping a post back into place, with 3 efficient strikes of the mallet. "Watch me like you're waiting for me to do something wrong. Not waiting for wrong, waiting to see how you do things right. Different way of watching. Is it?" Ask me in a week. She huffed something that was almost a laugh, and kept working. And Jonah thought, not for the first time since the ceremony, that this was going to be a stranger, and maybe a better, marriage than any he'd ever imagined for himself in the years before Rachel, back when a man his age still imagined such things at all. By afternoon, they'd moved the herd, and by evening Sanoa had shot a jackrabbit clean through with a single arrow from a distance that made Jonah whistle low under his breath, and skinned it herself before he could even offer to help. And they ate it together at the little table built for two. And for the first time in 3 years, the second charthus wasn't empty. Neither of them called it happiness. Not out loud. But it was close enough to the shape of it that both of them separately had started to let their guard down a little more with each passing day. A few mornings in, he made the mistake of bringing home a dress. Not a grand thing. Just something practical, store-bought. The kind of plain calico most ranch wives wore for church or town errands, picked up on impulse in Willow Bend because some part of him thought it might be a kindness, might make the transition easier, might help her fit into a world that was already looking hard enough for reasons to reject her. She looked at it a long moment after he handed it over, didn't say anything at first, which should have warned him. "You don't like it," he said. "I didn't say that. Didn't need to. Your face said it plenty." She set the dress down, careful, not but deliberate. "It's a fine dress. For a woman who wants to disappear into what this town expects of her." She met his eyes. "I don't want to disappear, Jonah. I spent my whole life refusing to be made smaller to fit somebody's comfort. I'm not about to start now, for a piece of calico, however well you meant it." He felt his face heat, embarrassed in a way he hadn't been in years. Wasn't trying to make you smaller. Was trying to make things easier. Easier for who? Not sharp exactly, but pointed. For me? Or for the town that's already decided what it thinks of me before I've said a single word to any of them? He sat with that a moment, and found, uncomfortable but honest, that she'd landed closer to the truth than he'd wanted to admit, even to himself. "Fair," he said finally. "Should have asked first. You should have." But something in her expression had softened, the sting gone out of it. "I know you meant well. That's not nothing. Most men wouldn't think to try at all." She picked the dress back up, turned it over once in her hands. "I'll keep it. Might wear it, on a day of my own choosing, for reasons of my own. Just don't mistake kindness for the same thing as understanding. I need you working toward the second one a great deal more than the first." "Noted," he said, and meant it, filing away the humbling lesson of a man learning, slow and imperfect, what it actually meant to build a life alongside someone instead of simply providing for them from a comfortable distance. The trouble started small. Trouble usually does. 3 days after the wedding, if it could be called a wedding. By the standards of the town, at least, Jonah rode into Willow Bend for supplies he'd normally have put off another week, mostly because he needed to see for himself just how bad the talk had already gotten. It was worse than he expected. Conversation didn't just stop when he walked into the general store. It curdled. He could feel it, thick and ugly, following him down the aisle like a smell. He couldn't quite place Mrs. Halloran at the counter, going stiff and silent, old man Pruitt turning his back entirely, rather than offer the nod he usually gave. 2 boys near the door, whispering something to each other that made them both snicker before their mother yanked them quiet. He bought his flour, his cartridges, paid without a word, and left without one either, because there wasn't a single sentence he could think to say that would make any of it better, and he'd learned a long time ago that some silences were just quieter than the alternative. Sterling Whitfield was waiting outside the store, leaning against the porch post like he'd simply happened to be passing, though Jonah didn't believe that for 1 second. Marrow, pleasant as ever, soft hands folded in front of him. "Heard some interesting news out of the Apache camp. I imagine you did. Congratulations are in order, I suppose." Whitfield's smile didn't reach anywhere near his eyes, though I confess I'm not entirely sure what to congratulate. A marriage, is it? Or something else the law might have a different name for? "Say what you mean, Sterling." "I always do." He pushed off the post, unhurried, strolled a slow half-circle around Jonah, like he was inspecting livestock at auction. "You're a man alone on a great deal of land, Marrow. Always have been, since your father passed. That kind of isolation makes a man vulnerable, makes a man's decisions easy to question when the time comes that somebody wants to question them. Is that a threat? It's a fact." Whitfield's voice never rose, never needed to. Facts have a way of doing more damage than threats ever could, in my experience. I'd think carefully if I were you about what kind of story this town gets to tell about you. Stories have consequences out here, especially for a man with no family left to stand behind him. I've got family, low, steady. Might not look like what this town's used to. Doesn't make it any less real. Whitfield's smile widened, thin and satisfied, like Jonah had just confirmed something he'd been hoping to hear. We'll see how real it looks to a judge, should it ever come to that. He touched the brim of his hat, mock polite. Give my regards to your wife, was it? Do enjoy the ride home, Mr. Merrow. Roads out past the ridge aren't always as safe as a man might like. He walked away before Jonah could decide whether that last line had been a threat too, or simply an observation dressed up to sound like one, and either way it sat cold and heavy in Jonah's gut the whole ride back to Shadow Creek. He didn't tell Sonoa all of it. Not that night. Told her some the cold shoulders in the store, Whitfield's veiled words on the porch, but left out the specific chill of that last line about the roads, because saying it out loud felt like giving it more power than it deserved, and because some part of him, old and stubborn, still wanted to protect her from the ugliest edges of his world, the way he hadn't been able to protect Rachel from anything at all. She saw through it anyway. Of course she did. You're leaving something out, she said, over supper, watching with that same sharp, unimpressed attention she'd turned on him back at the wash that first week. Just town talk. Jonah. Just his name. Flat. A warning wrapped in 2 syllables. He set down his fork. Whitfield said something about the roads not always being safe. Might have been nothing. Might have been a threat. Couldn't rightly tell you which. Her jaw tightened, and for a moment she looked less like a new bride, adjusting to a stranger's kitchen table, and more like the warrior he'd first seen at the creek, knife already in hand, before anyone else understood that danger had arrived. Men like that, she said, don't waste threats on nothing. He wants something. Land, most likely, or whatever's under it. And he's decided you're an obstacle worth clearing. She met his eyes. You should have told me straight off. Didn't want to worry you first night in a strange house. I've buried more people than you have years on this earth, Jonah Merrow. I don't worry easy. Something almost gentle crept into her voice despite the words. But I worry a great deal faster when the man I've bound my life to starts keeping things from me to spare my feelings. That's not protection. That's just a different kind of leaving me alone in the dark. He sat with that a long moment. Found, uncomfortably, that she was right, that the same instinct that had kept him silent and careful for 3 years, walling off every hard truth so it couldn't hurt anybody else, was the exact same instinct that had nearly cost him the chance to say a proper goodbye to Rachel, back when he'd spent her last good days too afraid of the truth to speak it plain. You're right, he said. Won't happen again. Good. She went back to her supper, matter of fact, like the matter was settled, though something in the set of her shoulders had eased. Now, tell me everything else you've been too proud to mention since I got here. That might take a while. I've got time, she said, and something almost like warmth flickered behind her eyes. Turns out I married a man who talks even less than I expected. We've got some catching up to do. He almost laughed. First time in longer than he could remember. And for the length of that laugh, Sterling Whitfield's cold threats on the porch felt very far away indeed. 2 days after that, against Jonah's quiet worry, Sonoa insisted on riding into town herself. You can't keep me locked away out here like something shameful, she said, saddling her own horse before he'd finished his coffee. If they're going to hate me, they can do it to my face. I've earned that much, at least. He couldn't argue with the logic, even as every protective instinct in him wanted to. So he rode with her, and together they walked into Willow Bend in broad daylight, and the town's reaction was worse than anything Jonah had faced alone. It wasn't loud. That was the ugly part of it. No shouting, no confrontation a man could plant his feet against and answer plain. Just silence, thick and deliberate, doors easing shut a beat too early as they approached, a woman on the boardwalk, gathering her skirts and crossing to the far side of the street, rather than pass within 10 feet of them. A group of men outside the saloon went quiet and watchful, one of them muttering something to his companions that made the others laugh low and ugly, though none of them said it loud enough to be answered directly. Sonoa walked through all of it with her chin level and her shoulders square, and Jonah, watching her, felt something fierce and protective and furious rise up in his chest all at once. At the general store, Mrs. Halloran refused flatly to serve them. We don't sell to her kind in here, she said, not even looking at Sanoa directly, addressing the words to Jonah instead like Sanoa. We're a piece of furniture rather than a person standing 3 feet away. You want supplies, Marrow, you come back alone. She's my wife, Jonah said. Quiet, dangerous in a way his voice rarely went. You'll serve her the same as you'd serve me, or you'll lose my custom permanent, and I'll make sure every rancher I know hears exactly why. Mrs. Halloran's mouth thinned to a hard line, but the threat of lost business apparently outweighed her prejudice by some narrow margin, and she rang up the order with sharp, resentful movements, refusing the entire time to meet Sanoa's eyes. Outside, once they'd remounted, Sanoa was quiet a long while, and Jonah didn't push her to talk until she was ready. I've faced raiders, she said finally, low. Faced men with guns and knives meaning to kill me. Never once flinched. She looked at him, something raw and unguarded in her expression. This is different. This wears you down slower, quieter, just as effective, in its own way. I know, Jonah said. I'm sorry you had to feel it. Don't be sorry. She straightened in the saddle, something fierce reasserting itself behind her eyes. Be angry with me instead. Anger, I can use. Sorry just sits there being useless. He almost smiled, despite everything. Angry then. Good, she said, and they rode home together, and neither one of them looked back at the town they'd left behind. Sheriff Garrick rode out to Shadow Creek 4 days later. Jonah saw the dust of his approach a good half-mile off, recognized the shape of the man in the saddle, and felt his stomach tighten before Garrick had even cleared the last rise. Sanoa noticed too she was at the corral, working a young mare that hadn't yet decided whether to trust a lead rope, and she went very still, very watchful, the way she did whenever something unfamiliar approached. Lawman, Jonah said low, as Garrick came into the yard. Might be nothing. Might not be. I'll be close, Sanoa said, which wasn't quite a promise to stay out of it, and they both knew that. Garrick dismounted slow, hat in hand, looking for all the world like a man who'd rather be anywhere else on earth. Marrow. Sham, Garrick added, with an awkward little nod toward Sanoa that seemed to surprise him as much as it surprised her. Like courtesy toward an Apache woman wasn't a reflex he'd had much practice with, but some stubborn decency in him insisted on it anyway. What brings you out here, Garrick? Jonah kept his voice even. Wasn't going to make this easy, whatever it was. There's been some concern raised. About the legality of your situation. Garrick's eyes flicked toward Sanoa and away again. Uncomfortable. Marriages outside recognized law. Land titles that haven't been resurveyed in a good while. I'm not saying I put much stock in any of it myself, Marrow. But I've got a job that requires me to look into what's raised. Who's concerned, Jonah said. Whitfield's? Garrick didn't answer that directly, and the silence answered plenty on its own. Look, Garrick said. Lower now, glancing back toward the road, like he half expected somebody to be listening. I've been sheriff of this county 11 years. Seen a lot of ugly things done and called legal 'cause the paper said so. I don't like what I'm being asked to do here. Doesn't mean I've got much choice in doing it. Then don't do it, Sanoa said. She'd come to stand beside Jonah without either man quite noticing the walk, and her voice was calm, level, entirely without malice, which somehow made it land harder than anger would have. A man always has a choice, Sheriff. He just doesn't always like the cost of the one he's avoiding. Garrick looked at her a long moment. Something moved behind his tired eyes, recognition maybe, or something closer to shame. You're not wrong, he admitted. I've got a brother in this town whose store would have folded 2 winters back if Sterling Whitfield hadn't extended credit nobody else was willing to extend. Man never once called that debt due in words. Doesn't need to. I know what I owe, same as anybody. He put his hat back on, slow like the weight of it had doubled since he'd taken it off. I'll do what I can to keep this fair, Marrow. That's the most honest promise I've got in me right now. I know it isn't much. It's more than nothing, Jonah said. Garrick nodded once, mounted up, and rode off without saying anything further, and Jonah watched him go, feeling like he'd just witnessed a man standing at the edge of a decision he hadn't yet worked up the courage to make. He's not your enemy, Sanoa said quietly, once the dust had settled. Not yet anyway. But he's not your friend either. Not while that debt's still sitting between him and Whitfield. Man like that, Jonah said, might surprise push. Might, she agreed. Men surprise you both directions, in my experience. Best not to bet the ranch on which way he'll fall until he actually falls. Garrick did not, in fact, let the matter drop the moment he rode off Jonah's land. That same evening alone, in the small back room of the sheriff's office that served as his records archive, he pulled the county's original land filings for Shadow Creek dusty, water-stained ledgers nobody had opened in years and began methodically comparing signatures. It didn't take him long to find what he was looking for. Old Merrow's original filing signature, from the ranch's founding 20-some years back, sat right there in black and white, and it looked nothing at all like the smooth, careful hand on the loan document Whitfield's bank had produced. Different slant, different pressure, the kind of difference a careful eye couldn't miss. Once it went looking, Garrick sat back in his chair a long while, staring at the two signatures side by side, feeling something old and tired and long-buried stir back to life in his chest, the slow, unwelcome discomfort of a man realizing he'd been asked to enforce a lie. He thought of his brother's store, thought of the quiet, unspoken debt that had kept that store's doors open 2 winters back, and the way Whitfield had never once called it due in words, content instead to simply let Garrick understand, without ever saying so directly, exactly what was expected of him in return. He didn't confront Whitfield that night, didn't confront anybody, just copied both signatures carefully onto a separate sheet, folded it, and locked it away in the bottom drawer of his own desk, telling himself it was simply prudent record-keeping. Nothing more, though some quieter, more honest part of him understood he was building something. A case. Evidence. The slow, careful groundwork of a man who hadn't yet found the courage to act on what he already knew, but who was, one folded document at a time, no longer entirely willing to look away either. He went to see his brother that same week, found Silas behind the counter of the little dry goods store Whitfield's credit had kept afloat, restocking shelves, with the careful pride of a man who'd nearly lost everything once and never wanted to feel that close to losing it again. "You look like a man carrying something heavy," Silas said, not looking up from his work. "Might be. Whitfield, business?" Garrick didn't answer right away, and that silence was answer enough. Silas set down the crate he'd been unpacking, straightened, studied his older brother with a directness that made Garrick want to look anywhere else. "Whatever he's got you doing," Silas said slowly, "I know you didn't ask for it. Know the credit he extended 2 winters back sits between you and whatever conscience is telling you to do different." He shook his head. "I never asked you to carry that weight for me, Ambrose. Wouldn't have wanted it if you'd told me the cost up front. Wasn't your choice to make, was mine." Garrick rubbed a hand over his tired face. "Man does what he has to keep family from going under. And what happens when doing right by the town costs you doing right by your own conscience instead?" Silas asked. Quiet, no judgment in it, just the plain hard question of a brother who knew him well enough to ask it. "You've worn that badge 11 years because you believed in what it stood for. I'd hate to watch you trade that away over a debt I never wanted paid at that particular cost." Garrick didn't have an answer for that. Not yet. But he left the store that afternoon, with something loosened in his chest that hadn't been loose. In a long while, the relief of a man realizing the weight he'd been carrying alone wasn't nearly so unbearable once somebody else offered to help him set it down. Back at the Apache camp, the trouble was quieter, but no less dangerous for its quiet. Isha had not taken well to watching Sanoa ride off with a white rancher, had not taken well to the murmurs that followed him now. Whenever he passed through camp, the pitying looks of people who knew he'd been swallowed over twice now, once by Sanoa's own choosing, and once by the debt ceremony that had handed her to a stranger instead. Pride was a heavy thing to carry through a small camp where everybody watched everybody else's business. Isha carried his badly. He was sitting alone at the edge of camp, not long after the ceremony, sharpening a knife he had no particular need to sharpen, when a man he didn't recognize approached from the tree line, a white man, rough-dressed, moving careful and slow, with his hands visible, the way a man moves when he doesn't want to be mistaken for a threat before he's had a chance to speak. "You're Isha," the man said. Not a question. "Who's asking?" "Name doesn't matter." The man crouched a respectful distance away, not close enough to threaten, close enough to talk low. "I hear you had a claim on the woman they call Sanoa. Hear it didn't work out the way you'd hoped." Isha's grip tightened on the knife. "What's it to you?" "Nothing personal. Business is all." The man produced a small leather pouch, let it sit heavy and visible in his open palm without quite offering it yet. "There's men willing to pay good money for information. Where she's living now. What her days look like. When the rancher's off the property and when he isn't." A pause, deliberate. "Nobody's asking you to lift a hand against her. Just information. Man in your position seems like a way to get a little of your own back without ever having to look anybody in the eye about it. Isha said nothing for a long moment, stared at the pouch, stared at the man's careful, patient face. Why would I help men who tried to take our women at the creek? He said finally. Same men who put a bullet in my chief. Different men, the stranger said smoothly, though nothing in his tone suggested honesty had much to do with the claim. New arrangement. Better funded. Man paying for this information's got no interest in raiding the camp. Just wants to know the rancher's patterns. That's all. That's the whole of it. It wasn't true. Isha would come to understand, much later, just how far from true it was. But pride is a hungry thing, and humiliation makes even careful men reach for anything that promises to feed it, and Isha furious, wounded, watching a woman he'd wanted for 2 winters ride off into a stranger's life while the whole camp whispered about his loss. Behind careful hands reached out and took the pouch before he'd fully decided to. Information only, he said. Like saying it aloud might make it true. Information only. The stranger agreed, already rising, already turning to go. We'll be in touch. Isha sat a long while after the man disappeared back into the trees, the pouch heavy and cold in his palm, telling himself a story about vengeance and justice that he half believed and half already knew, somewhere beneath the wounded pride, was going to cost more than he currently understood. He didn't spend the money. Not at first. Buried the pouch beneath a flat stone near his lodge and told himself for 3 days running that he hadn't decided anything yet, that holding information wasn't the same as selling it, that a man could take a thing and still choose later never to use it. His friend Chodo found him on the 4th night, sitting alone by a dying fire, and sat down without asking the way old friends do. You've been strange since the ceremony, Chodo said. Strange even before that, if I'm honest. What's sitting on you? Isha almost told him. Opened his mouth to it. The confession, sitting right there at the back of his throat. I took money from Sersher, who means the rancher, harm, and I don't know how to give it back without admitting what I've already done. But pride, the same pride that had gotten him into this in the first place, closed his mouth back up before the words could get free. Nothing, he said instead, just tired. Chodo studied him a long moment, unconvinced, but let it go the way good friends sometimes do, trusting a man to come to his own confessions in his own time. Sanoa made her choice, Chodo said. Gentler now. Wasn't a rejection of you, specifically. Was just her choice. You'll find your own path, Isha. Don't let this one make you into somebody you'd be ashamed to be. Isha said nothing. Stared into the dying fire long after Chodo had gone to his own lodge, the buried pouch, sitting heavy beneath its stone not 30 feet away, and told himself one more time that he still hadn't decided anything. He was, even then, already lying to himself. He simply hadn't found the courage yet to admit it. Chief Tocho called a council 2 nights later, his shoulder still bound, his voice still not fully recovered its old strength, but his authority undiminished for all that. Word had reached him the way word reaches every chief eventually, carried on a dozen careful tongues that certain elders had begun murmuring doubt about the wisdom of the marriage, that some believed the debt had been satisfied by ceremony alone, and that Sanoa, tangled now in a white rancher's legal troubles, ought to be called home before those troubles spread further than the rancher's own doorstep. The debt was not a transaction to be undone at the first sign of difficulty, Tocho said, his voice carrying clear and hard across the assembled circle despite its weakness. It was a bond. Bonds are tested precisely at the moment they become inconvenient. That is when their worth is proven, not before. An elder named Chagra, gray-haired and cautious by nature, rose to answer him. With respect, Tocho, we did not send our daughter into a white man's war. If his enemies come for him, they may come for her as well, and for this camp behind her. Is that a risk we agreed to when we offered the ceremony? We agreed to honor a man who saved my life at the cost of putting himself between my people and 6 armed guns, Tocho said. I do not recall the agreement carrying a clause that excused us from standing with him. The moment standing became costly. That is not honor, Chagra. That is convenience wearing honor's clothing. The debate went late into the night, voices rising and falling around the fire. And though no formal decision was reached, Tocho's authority still carried enough weight to hold the matter open, rather than settled the doubt, once spoken aloud, did not simply evaporate. It settled instead into the camp's quiet undercurrent, waiting, the way doubt always waits, for the next piece of bad news to give it fresh strength. Isha sat at the edge of that circle throughout the entire debate, saying nothing, the buried pouch beneath its stone, weighing on him, heavier with every word spoken about honor and cost, and the true price of a bond kept faithfully. He left before the council fully broke apart, unable to sit any longer beneath the weight of everything he hadn't yet confessed. The weeks that followed fell into a rhythm neither Jonah nor Sanoa had quite expected, and both in their separate careful ways had come to treasure more than they'd admit out loud. Mornings were work fences, cattle, the endless small maintenances a ranch demanded whether a man's heart was in it or not. Afternoons, more often than not, found them together doing something that had nothing to do with survival and everything to do with two people slowly, cautiously, learning the shape of each other. One such afternoon, mending a torn saddle blanket together on the porch, Sanoa told him about her mother, a healer, well-respected in the camp, who died of a winter sickness when Sanoa was barely more than a girl. Told him how she'd learned the names of plants at her mother's side, how to read a wound and know whether it would heal clean or fester, how to sit with the dying and make their leaving easier. All of it passed down in quiet afternoons, very much like this one, before the raids and the losses had hardened her into something the camp had started calling too hard for marrying. I think, Jonah said. Once she'd finished, your mother would be proud of what you carried forward. All of it. The healing and the fighting both. I used to wonder, Sanoa admitted, quiet, whether becoming a fighter meant I'd failed to become what she wanted for me. Whether the softness she taught me got buried too deep under everything that came after. Doesn't sound buried to me, Jonah said. Sounds like it's sitting right here, mending a saddle blanket with more patience than I've got for the job myself. She looked at him a long moment, something warm and unguarded moving behind her eyes, and set the needle down long enough to reach over and squeeze his hand once, brief, wordless, before picking the work back up, and Jonah understood, watching her, that he was witnessing something rare. A woman slowly, carefully, allowing herself to believe that all the pieces of who she was might finally belong somewhere, together, without needing to choose between the softness and the strength. She taught him a little of her language, actually laughing, unguarded at his terrible attempts at the harder sounds. You're saying it wrong, she told him, for perhaps the 10th time, as he mangled the word for rain into something that made her cover her mouth to hide a grin. I'm saying it exactly the way you told me to say it. You are not. You're saying it like a man with a mouth full of gravel. High praise coming from you. It wasn't meant as praise. Didn't stop it from landing as some. She threw a scrap of bread at him for that, and he caught it out of the air without looking, and something passed between them in that moment, quick, warm, entirely unguarded on both sides for just a heartbeat that neither one of them commented on, though both of them noticed it plenty. He taught her, in turn, the parts of ranching she hadn't grown up around, how to read a storm coming by the particular color the sky turned an hour before it broke, how to gentle a spooked horse without ever raising his voice above a murmur, how to mend a fence post so it would hold against wind that had knocked down 3 others in the same line. She was a quick study, quicker than he was with her language if he was honest, which needled his pride just enough to make her laugh at him about it regularly. You're competitive, she observed one afternoon, after outroping him twice in a row on a calf he'd been chasing for 10 minutes. Didn't used to be. Grief does strange things to a man's edges. Softens some, sharpens others. She coiled her rope easy and practiced. I don't mind the sharp parts, for what it's worth. Better than a man who's gone entirely soft and calls it peace. Is that what you think of me? Sharp? She considered the question, with more seriousness than he expected. I think you're a man who buried the sharpest parts of himself, along with his wife, and you've spent 3 years pretending the burial was permanent. I think it wasn't. I think it's coming back up, slow, whether you meant for it to or not. He didn't have an answer for that. Just looked at her a long moment, feeling the ground under his careful heart shift a little further. Something he was starting to suspect wasn't going away, no matter how carefully he'd tried to keep himself fenced off from ever risking this kind of exposure again. One evening, near the end of that first easy month, a trader passing through with a small cart of goods stopped at the ranch to barter, and among his wares was a battered old fiddle that had clearly seen better decades. Jonah, on impulse he couldn't fully explain even to himself, traded 2 days' worth of jerky for it. You play? Sanoa asked, eyeing the instrument with open skepticism once the trader had gone. Used to. Rachel liked to dance in the kitchen of an evening, and somebody had to provide the music. He turned it over in his hands, testing the strings, wincing at how badly they'd gone out of tune. Been a long while. I might sound like a cat caught in a fence. I'd like to hear it anyway. So he played. Badly at first, fingers stiff and unpracticed, and Sanoa laughed outright at the worst of the screeching, unguarded and bright in a way that made something in his chest ache pleasantly. But he found the shape of an old tune eventually, slow and simple, and when he looked up she'd gone quiet, watching him with an expression he hadn't seen from her, before soft, unguarded, faintly wondering. "Dance with me," he said, before he'd fully thought it through. "I don't know how. Not the way you mean it. Neither do I. Really, not anymore. Been 3 years since anybody asked me to remember." He set the fiddle aside, held out a hand. "We'll be terrible together. Seems fitting, given everything else about us." She hesitated only a moment before taking his hand, and they moved together in the small kitchen, clumsy and slow and laughing more than once at their own mismatched rhythm. And somewhere in the middle of that unpracticed, imperfect, Jonah Bake acutely, dangerously aware of how close she'd drifted, how her hand had settled warm against his shoulder, how neither of them had pulled away when the song's natural stopping point arrived and passed unnoticed. They stood there a moment, close, still, the fiddle's last note fading into the quiet kitchen around them. "Jonah," she said low, and it wasn't a question exactly, but it left room for one. He almost closed that last small distance between them. Almost. Except a coyote's distant cry split the night outside, sharp and sudden, and both of them startled apart. Instinct override sending them both toward the window, before either had consciously decided to move the old habits of two people who'd each learned, the hard way, never to let their guard down fully, even in the gentlest of moments. The coyote was nothing. Just a coyote. But the moment had passed regardless, and they stood there afterward, a little breathless, a little embarrassed, something unspoken hanging warm and unresolved between them. "Another night," Jonah said, quiet. "Another night," she agreed, and neither one of them quite managed to look away from the other for several long seconds after, before the ordinary business of banking the fire and readying for sleep finally, reluctantly, pulled them back into the shape of an evening that hadn't, in the end, gone anywhere near where it had briefly threatened to. Sanoa rode back to camp alone one afternoon to check on Chief Tocho's recovery, and found Isha waiting near the trail, as though he'd been watching for her arrival. "Sanoa." He didn't quite meet her eyes. "A word, if you'll give me one." She reined in, wary old instinct sharpening despite the years of familiarity between them. "Say it then. I hope you're well. Out at the rancher's place." The words came stiff, rehearsed sounding, nothing like his usual bluntness. "Whatever troubles found him, I hope it passes you by." "Strange thing for you to say," she said, watching him carefully. "You've barely spoken 2 words to me since the ceremony. Why the sudden concern?" Something flickered across his face, guilt, though she didn't yet have the context to name it as such. Can't a man wish another well, even after disappointment? He can. You never have before now. Not with me. She studied him a long moment, sharp and assessing, the same instinct that had kept her alive through a dozen raids, prickling now at something wrong in the air between them. Something she couldn't quite name. "Isha, is there something you need to tell me?" He held her gaze for one long, taut second, and she would think back on that second, many times in the weeks to come, wondering what might have changed if he'd simply spoken the truth right then, in that quiet moment on the trail, before pride could reassert itself and close his mouth back up. "No," he said finally. "Nothing. Ride safe, Sanoa." He turned and walked away before she could press further, and she sat her horse a long moment, staring after him, that same prickling unease, refusing to fully settle, though she had no proof yet of anything beyond a strange, stilted conversation, and a man who couldn't quite meet her eyes. She mentioned it to Jonah that evening in passing, unable to shake the feeling even as she couldn't articulate its source. "Something's wrong with Isha. Can't say what. Just a feeling. Rejected men carry all kinds of strange weather in them," Jonah said. "Might be nothing more than that." "Might be," she agreed, though the unease lingered, quiet and persistent, in the back of her mind for days afterward, a warrior's instinct sensing danger before the mind has gathered enough evidence to name it plainly. Whitfield's next move came dressed as generosity, which was, Jonah would later think, exactly the kind of move a man like Sterling Whitfield would consider clever. A letter arrived by Ryder, a little over a month after the wedding, thick paper, formal script, An offer to purchase the entire Shadow Creek property at a price that was, on its face, almost insultingly fair. Almost enough to make a tired, grieving man consider it, if a tired, grieving man hadn't already learned to smell a trap wrapped in kindness. Jonah read it twice at the kitchen table. Sanoa read it over his shoulder, silent, her jaw tightening with every line. "He's not offering you money," she said finally. "He's offering you an exit. Wants you gone before whatever he's actually planning gets messy enough that people start asking questions about why. That's about the shape of it. You're not taking it. Wasn't planning to." He set the letter down, rubbed a hand over his face, tired in a way that had nothing to do with the day's work. "My father built this place with his own 2 hands. I've got 2 graves up on that hill I'm not about to leave behind for any price a man like Whitfield's willing to pay." Sanoa was quiet a moment. When she spoke again, her voice had gone careful, deliberate. "There's no shame in it if you needed to consider it. Land isn't worth more than your safety, than ours. I know that." He looked at her, steady. "This isn't about pride. Isn't even really about the land if I'm honest with myself. It's about not letting a man like that decide what my life's worth, just because he's got more money than decency. Somebody's got to stand in that particular gap, Sanoa. Might as well be me. I've got less to lose than most these days, and more reason than most to know exactly what standing in a gap is worth." She studied him a long moment, something unreadable moving behind her dark eyes. "You're a stubborn man," she said finally. "Been told." "Good," she said, and there was warmth under the word, real and unguarded. "I don't much care for men who fold easy, never have." The fake documents arrived a week after that, carried not by a rider this time but delivered in person, with all the formal solemnity Whitfield could apparently muster when it suited him. He came out to the ranch himself, accompanied by a thin, nervous-looking man Jonah didn't recognize, introduced only as a representative from the Territorial Land Office in Tucson. Sheriff Garrick trailed a careful distance behind, hat low, saying nothing, his discomfort plain enough that even the nervous land office man seemed to notice it. "Mr. Merrow." Whitfield's smile hadn't changed a bit since the porch outside the general store. "I'm afraid there's a matter of some seriousness we need to discuss. Say it plain, Sterling. I've got fences to mend, very well." Whitfield nodded to the nervous man, who produced a folder of papers, hands trembling slightly as he held them out. "It appears your father, some years before his passing, took out a substantial loan against this property. A loan that was never fully repaid. My bank, having recently acquired the original note through a series of entirely legitimate transactions, is now owed the outstanding balance, a sum, I'm afraid, considerably beyond what a working ranch like this one could reasonably produce." Jonah took the papers. Read them slow, his jaw tightening with every line, because even a man with no legal training could see the signature at the bottom didn't sit right, too smooth, too careful, nothing at all like the rough, practical hand his father had used for every letter and ledger Jonah had ever seen him write. "This isn't my father's signature, I assure you, Mr. Merrow. The document has been verified," I said. Jonah repeated, low and hard, "This isn't my father's signature. I'd know his hand blind. This is a forgery, Sterling, and we both know it." Whitfield's smile didn't waver, though something colder moved behind his eyes. "That's a serious accusation. One I'd think carefully about repeating in front of witnesses, Mr. Merrow, unless you've got proof to back it, Sheriff." He glanced toward Garrick. "Perhaps you'd care to weigh in on the legal standing of a verified bank document." All eyes turned to Garrick. The sheriff shifted, uncomfortable, caught between 2 versions of himself. He hadn't yet managed to reconcile the man who owed Whitfield a debt he couldn't repay, and the man who'd sworn an oath 11 years back to uphold something bigger than any single man's convenience. "I'll need to look into the provenance of that note," Garrick said finally, careful, measured, giving away as little as possible in either direction. "Proper. Through the Territorial Records Office. That's not a fast process, Sterling. Could take some weeks." Something flickered across Whitfield's face, brief, controlled, but Jonah caught it. Irritation. The particular irritation of a man who'd expected an easier rubber stamp than he was currently getting. "Weeks," Whitfield repeated, flat. "Weeks," Garrick confirmed. "Man's entitled to a proper review before anybody starts talking about foreclosure, Sterling. That's the law. I intend to follow it. It wasn't a rebellion, not yet. But it was the first crack Jonah had seen in whatever arrangement bound Garrick to Whitfield's convenience. And small as it was, it mattered. Whitfield recovered his composure quick enough. tucking the papers back into the nervous clerk's folder, with a smile that had gone thin and brittle at the edges. "Take your weeks, Sheriff." He turned back to Jonah, and there was nothing pleasant left in his voice at all now. Nothing but the cold, patient calculation of a man used to winning eventually, however long it took. "In the meantime, Mr. Marrow, I'd think carefully about how many more fights you can afford to pick at once. A contested land title, a marriage this territory doesn't recognize, a wife whose own people, I understand, aren't entirely at peace with the arrangement either." His eyes flicked just briefly toward the tree line beyond the ranch. "It's a great deal for one isolated man to carry alone. I'd hate to see you carry it into the ground." He left without waiting for a response, the nervous clerk hurrying after him, and Garrick lingered a moment longer, something apologetic in the set of his shoulders. "I'll do what I can," he said low, to Jonah alone. "Wanted you to know that much, at least." Then he was gone too, and Jonah stood in his own yard a long while, the forged paper's weight still sitting heavy in his chest even though he no longer held them, thinking about his father's real signature and what kind of man forged a dead man's hand to steal a living one's home. Maeva rode out to the ranch 2 days later, alone, unannounced, and Sanoa met her at the fence line with open surprise. "You shouldn't be riding this far alone," Sanoa said, though there was warmth under the scold. "I wanted to see for myself how you were faring. Word at camp makes it sound like the whole valley's come down on your house at once." Maeva dismounted, glancing toward the main house, toward Jonah working near the barn. "Is it true?" "The bank, the legal notices." "True enough." Sanoa's jaw tightened. "We're managing. You don't have to manage alone. Whatever the council decides about the marriage, you're still one of us, Sanoa. That doesn't change because some old men get frightened and start looking for reasons to call an inconvenient bond finished." Maeva's voice had none of its ceremonial softness now, only a fierce, quiet loyalty. "I've heard the talk. Chagra and the others. I think it's cowardice dressed up as caution, and I've said so, more than once, when it wasn't my place to speak at all." Sanoa softened, something grateful crossing her face. "Thank you for that. Don't thank me. You stood beside me at the ceremony when the whole camp expected us to be rivals, and you weren't. I don't forget things like that." Maeva glanced once more toward the house, a small private smile touching her mouth. "Besides, I have my own reasons for hoping this valley learns to make room for love that doesn't look like what everyone expects. Reasons I'm not quite ready to speak aloud yet, even to you." Sanoa raised an eyebrow at that, curious but didn't push. "Whenever you're ready." "Whenever I'm ready," Maeva agreed, and the two women stood together a while longer in the afternoon sun, two very different paths bound, in their own separate ways, by the same quiet defiance of a world eager to tell them both who they were allowed to become. Jonah rode out to see Chief Tocho that same week, drawn by a question that had sat unfinished in his chest since that first fireside conversation weeks before. He found the old man sitting up outside his lodge, stronger now, though the shoulder still stiffened badly in cold weather. "You said you knew of my father," Jonah said, without much preamble, once the customary greetings had passed between them. "Said we'd speak of it another day. Reckon today's as good as any, given everything else pressing down on us both." Tocho was quiet a long moment, studying the fire between them with an expression Jonah couldn't quite read, something between old grief and old caution. "There is a history there," Tocho admitted finally. "Longer than you know. Older than the trouble you're facing now, though I suspect, before this is finished, the two may prove more tangled together than either of us currently understands." He looked up, meeting Jonah's eyes directly. "It is not a short story, and I am not yet certain it is mine alone to tell. Give me time, Jonah Marrow. When the moment is right, you will have the whole of it. I promise you that much." "Whitfield's coming at me with everything he's got," Jonah said, frustration creeping into his voice despite himself. "Forged papers. Legal notices. If there's something about my father that bears on any of this, I'd rather know it now than find out too late to use it." "I understand the urgency," Tocho said, gentle but firm. "But some truths told before their time do more harm than the silence that preceded them. Trust me a little longer. I have not steered you wrong yet, have I?" Jonah sat with that, frustration warring with the plain fact that the old man had, in every dealing between them so far, proven honest even when honesty cost him something. "No," he admitted, "you haven't." "Then trust me a while longer still," Tocho said, and something in his tired old eyes suggested the withheld truth weighed on him every bit as heavily as its absence weighed on Jonah. though neither man, that afternoon, could have guessed just how soon circumstance would force that particular truth into the open, whether either of them felt ready for it or not. Earlier that same day, alone, Jonah had climbed the rise above the house to the cottonwood tree for the first time. In longer than he could remember the two graves sitting quiet beneath it, weathered now, the wooden markers gone soft and gray with years of sun. He hadn't planned the visit, had simply found his feet carrying him there, while Sanoa was occupied mending tack near the barn, some pull he didn't fully understand drawing him up the slope he'd spent 3 years carefully avoiding. He stood there a long while, saying nothing out loud, though plenty passed through him all the same. Guilt. At first, sharp and familiar, the old reflexive guilt of a man who'd let himself feel something for someone new, as though feeling it were a betrayal of what had come before. But underneath the guilt, something else stirred too, something he hadn't expected to find waiting for him on that quiet hill. Permission, maybe, or something close enough to it. "I think you'd have liked her," he said finally, quiet to the wind and the weathered markers and whatever remained listening. Ornery, sharp-tongued. Doesn't take my nonsense for one single minute. A pause, his throat tight. Don't reckon loving her means loving you any less. Took me a long while to understand that. Understand it now. He stood there a while longer, until the worst of the ache had settled into something quieter, more bearable, and then he walked back down the hill toward the house, toward the woman, waiting there who'd never asked him to forget anything, only to keep living regardless. And it was that same evening, lighter somehow for the visit, that he finally told her everything. That night, for the first time since the wedding, Jonah told Sanoa everything, all of it. Rachel, the fever, the years of careful silence, the particular guilt of a man who'd survived something his wife hadn't. She listened without interrupting, the firelight catching the sharp planes of her face. And when he finally ran out of words, she reached across the small distance between them and set her hand, deliberate, over the old scar on his forearm, a thin white line from a rope burn years back. Nothing compared to her own scars, but the only one he had to offer in trade for everything she'd shown him. "Thank you," she said, simple, "for trusting me with the weight of it. Didn't figure I had much choice. Man can only carry a thing alone so long before it starts carrying him instead." "I know that particular weight," she said quiet, "better than most." He looked at her a long moment in the firelight, really looked, the way he'd looked at her that first day at the ceremony. Except everything underneath the looking had changed since then, deepened into something neither of them had a full name for yet. "Sanoa," he said, careful with the shape of it, though he'd said her name 100 times by now. "What does it mean, your name?" She was quiet a moment, something soft and unguarded moving across her face. Stillness. "My mother named me for it, hoping it might settle something restless in me. Didn't work, obviously." A small, wry smile. "Wrong name for a woman who spent her whole life fighting." "I don't think it's wrong," Jonah said. "Think maybe it's not about the fighting at all. Think maybe it's about what's underneath it. What you carry steady, no matter how loud everything around you gets." She didn't answer that right away. When she did, her voice had gone soft in a way he'd only heard once before, that first night by the creek, before the ceremony. "You see people clearer than most men I've known," she said. "It's a dangerous thing, letting yourself be seen that clearly. I'd nearly forgotten how it felt." "Nearly?" "Nearly," she agreed, and let her hand stay where it rested on his arm, a moment longer than either of them strictly needed. And outside the small house the wind was beginning, faint and distant, to pick up the first quiet warning of a storm neither of them yet knew was coming, in more ways than one. The storm broke 2 days later, fast and hard, the kind that rolled in off the peaks with almost no warning at all. Jonah and Sanoa were out checking the herd when the sky went the particular bruised green-black that meant trouble was minutes away rather than hours, and they barely made it to the old line shack at the edge of the north pasture before the rain came down in sheets thick enough to blind a man 3 feet in front of his own horse. The shack was small. 1 room, a dirt floor, a wood stove that hadn't been lit in months and took 20 minutes of coaxing before it finally caught. They sat close to it once it did, close to each other by simple necessity of the small space, listening to the storm hammer the roof and rattle the single shuttered window. "Going to be a long night," Sanoa said. "Looks that way." Neither of them moved to put more distance between them. Neither of them, if pressed, would have wanted to. Outside, the wind found every gap in the old shack's walls, and turned each one into a low, mournful whistle. And somewhere overhead a loose shingle beat an irregular rhythm against the roof, and for a long while neither of them spoke at all, simply sat close in the small warm circle of the stove's light while the world outside tried its best to tear itself apart. I keep thinking about what Whitfield said, Jonah admitted eventually, quiet, about isolation making a man vulnerable. Hate that he's not entirely wrong. You're not isolated, Sanoa said, not anymore. Whatever else that man's taken from you in his head, he hasn't managed to take that. No, Jonah agreed, something easing in his chest at the certainty in her voice. Reckon he hasn't. They talked that night, longer and more openly than they had since the wedding, about her raids, the ones she'd survived, and the ones that had cost her friends she still carried grief for, quiet and unshowy, the way a person carries grief that's had years to settle into something bearable rather than raw. About his father, the man who'd built this ranch and taught him half of what he knew about standing firm when the ground wanted to give way beneath him. About Rachel one more time, not the ending of her this time, but the living of her, the sound of her laugh, the way she used to hum off-key while she worked. Small warm things he hadn't let himself remember out loud in 3 years. You loved her a great deal, Sanoa said. Not a question, just an observation, gentle. Still do. Don't figure that stops just because she's gone. I wouldn't want it to. She was quiet a moment, watching the fire. I'd be lying if I said I understood love the way you mean it. Never had the chance to learn it. Not that way. Fighting takes up a great deal of room in a person's life. Doesn't leave much space for softer things. Might be time to make some room then. He said it careful, testing the words as they left him. If you wanted to. She looked at him a long moment, firelight moving across her face, and reached out slow, deliberate, the way she did most things, and traced 2 fingers along the old rope scar on his forearm, the same one she'd touched 2 nights before, except this time neither of them looked away from the touching. I might want to, she said, quiet. Might already be further along that road than I planned on admitting. He said her name then, not Sanoa, the version he'd been using since the ceremony, but the small private inflection of it she'd taught him weeks back, the one that changed the weight of the word into something closer to dear one, and something in her face came fully undone at the sound of it, unguarded in a way he hadn't seen from her yet, not once, not even at the creek where he'd first her fight, like something unstoppable. You learned that, she said, soft. Been practicing. Badly still. But she smiled, real and unguarded, better than before. They sat together a long while after that. Close, quiet, the storm hammering on outside while something entirely different, entirely gentler, settled between them inside, no promises made yet, nothing declared out loud in words either of them was fully ready for, but something real all the same, the fragile warmth of 2 people who'd each spent years, certain they'd never let anyone close enough again to matter, slow and startled that they'd been wrong. They rode back to the ranch house the next morning to find trouble waiting. A single rider was tied at the fence post, not Garrick's horse, not anyone Jonah recognized at first glance, and a man stood on the porch with his hat in his hands, looking for all the world like he'd rather be anywhere else on earth than delivering whatever news he'd been sent to deliver. Mr. Merrow. The man's voice shook slightly. A clerk, by the look of his clothes, younger than the last one Whitfield had sent. I've been asked to deliver formal notice. Notice of what? The clerk swallowed hard, produced a folded document, held it out at arm's length, like it might bite him. The bank's filing a formal claim against this property, pending the outstanding debt. He hesitated, glancing nervously between Jonah and Sanoa. There's a separate matter. A petition's been filed questioning the legal standing of your marriage. Says here it wasn't performed under any ceremony recognized by territorial law, and that a woman not lawfully your wife has no standing to reside on contested property. If the court finds in the bank's favor on either matter, you could be looking at eviction inside 30 days. The words hung in the cold morning air a long moment, and a hard, cold fury rose fast through Jonah, all at once. 30 days, he repeated. Yes, sir. The clerk was already backing toward his horse, clearly eager to be done with the whole errand. I'm sorry, Mr. Merrow. Just delivering what I was told to deliver. He rode off fast, and Jonah stood there with the notice in his hand, Sanoa silent and tense beside him, both of them staring at the same cold document that had just put a number on how much time they had left before Sterling Whitfield's patient, calculated cruelty, finally came due. Jonah read it through twice, slow, his hands not quite steady, and when he finally set it down on the porch rail, his voice came out rougher than he intended. 30 days, he said again, like repeating it might make it smaller. 30 days to prove a dead man's signature and a living woman's marriage both mean something. In a court that's already decided neither one does. We'll find a way, Sanoa said, though even she couldn't quite keep the strain fully out of her voice. Garrick's looking into the records. That's something. Something isn't 30 days worth of proof. He pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes a moment, exhausted in a way that went bone deep. Man spends 3 years building a quiet life, just careful enough that nothing else can touch it. And then one act of decency at a creek unravels the whole careful architecture of it in under a month. Would you take it back? Sanoa asked, quiet, watching him carefully. If you could. The creek. All of it. He looked at her a long moment, and whatever exhaustion had crept into his voice moments before fell away entirely. Not for one single second, he said. Whatever this costs me. Wouldn't trade it back. Not for the land, not for the quiet, not for any version of safe I had before you rode into my life and turned every careful thing about it upside down. He reached for her hand, found it already reaching for his. We'll find the 30 days worth of proof. Somehow. Together. She held his hand tight, and together they stood on the porch a long while, watching the empty road that had carried the clerk away, neither one of them yet aware of just how many separate threats were converging, slow and patient, from every direction at once. The pressure, once it started closing in, closed in from every direction at once. 3 days after the eviction notice, word reached the ranch carried by one of the younger Apache men who still occasionally rode out to trade, that trouble had stirred back up at the camp as well. A faction of elders, stoked by whispers Jonah suspected he could trace straight back to Isha's wounded pride, had begun openly questioning whether Sanoa's marriage had been a mistake, whether handing a warrior of her standing over to a white rancher, now under siege by his own people's law, had been wisdom or folly. Some argued the debt to Jonah had been paid in full already, simply by the ceremony itself, and that Sanoa ought to be called home, before his troubles became her troubles, became the whole camp's troubles. Chief Tocha, still recovering, still weak from the wound at the creek, held the descent at bay for now. But Jonah understood, listening to the messenger's careful, worried account, that for now was a phrase with an expiration date, same as everything else closing in around them. And somewhere out past the ridge, unseen, unknown to either Jonah or Sanoa, the same bounty hunters who'd fled the creek weeks before were beginning to circle back, better funded this time, better informed, thanks to a wounded, prideful young man who'd taken a stranger's coin in exchange for information he was only now, slowly beginning to understand the true cost of. Sanoa woke first, well past midnight, some instinct honed by years of raids pulling her out of sleep before her mind had even caught up to why. She lay still, listened. Nothing. Except there, faint. A horse-shifting weight somewhere past the tree line, too far off for an ordinary night sound, too close to be nothing at all. She woke Jonah with a hand pressed light over his mouth, a habit from years of needing silence to matter more than explanation, and he came awake fast and quiet, the way she'd taught him these past weeks, without either of them naming the lesson out loud. Riders, she breathed, barely sound at all. North tree line, 2, maybe 3. They moved without lamps, without a single wasted motion, Jonah reaching the rifle by the door while Sanoa slipped out the back with her bow already strung. And for a long, taut stretch of minutes the two of them held position in the dark, watching, waiting, every sense straining toward the tree line where something patient and unfriendly sat, just beyond the reach of sight. Whoever it was didn't advance, seemed instead to simply watch a long, silent reconnaissance, the particular patient scouting of men who weren't ready to move yet, only wanted to learn the shape of what they'd eventually be moving against. After the better part of an hour, the faint sounds retreated, hoofbeats fading soft into the distance, and Jonah and Sanoa were left standing in the dark yard, adrenaline still thrumming through both of them, staring at an empty tree line that had, moments before, held something watching them back. They're scouting us, Sanoa, once they'd finally gone back inside. Learning our patterns. When you're off with the herd. When the house sits empty. Same men from the creek? Maybe. Maybe new ones working for the same purpose. Her jaw was tight, her earlier calm replaced with something harder, more alert. Either way, somebody's planning something more than a threatening letter this time. Jonah set the rifle down, slow, feeling the full weight of everything converging at once: the bank, the law, the camp's doubts, and now this, patient and armed and circling closer by the night. We need a warning system. Something better than luck and your ears. Agreed. She was already moving to the window, scanning the tree line one more time, restless with the particular energy of a fighter denied a fight she knew was coming regardless. Tomorrow, we'll set trip lines along the northern approach. Bells, maybe, or something that carries sound further than a horse's careful steps. She looked back at him. Something grim and determined settled into her expression. Whoever's out there, Jonah Marrow, they're not finished. Sir, this was reconnaissance. Next time, it won't be. Neither of them slept much the rest of that night, and by the time dawn came gray and reluctant over the ridge, both of them understood, without needing to say it aloud, that whatever fragile peace they'd built these past weeks was drawing, fast now, toward its final and most dangerous test. The warning, when it came, wasn't subtle. Jonah found it 2 mornings later, riding out early to check the herd a length of fence cut clean through along the western boundary, and draped over the broken rail, deliberate, impossible to miss, the carcass of a young steer, throat cut, left to bleed out slow rather than killed clean. Pinned to the fence post beside it, a scrap of paper, block letters scrawled rough across it: next time it won't be cattle. He sat his horse a long moment, jaw tight, fury and fear tangling together in his chest in equal measure, before riding back hard for the house. Sanoa was at the corral when he arrived, and she read his face before he'd said a single word. "What?" he told her. Watched her expression go from alarm to a cold, focused anger that reminded him, sharply, of the woman who'd stood over Tocho at the creek with a knife already in hand before anyone else understood the danger had arrived. "They're trying to frighten us into running," she said, "or frighten us into a mistake they can use against us. Either way, we can't afford to give them what they're fishing for." "I know it." Jonah dismounted, hands not quite steady. "Doesn't make it easier to look at a dead animal and a threat with your name sitting right underneath it, even unwritten." "No," she agreed, quiet. "It doesn't." She reached for his hand, steadying, and for a moment they simply stood together in the yard, absorbing the particular cold weight of a threat that had stopped being abstract and become, instead, something with blood on it. "We ride to Garrick. Today. Whatever debt binds him to Whitfield, dead livestock and written threats are still a crime he's sworn to investigate. Let's see how far that oath actually stretches." They rode to town together within the hour, and Garrick, to his credit, came out to the ranch himself before the day was through, examined the cut fence and the note with a grim, careful thoroughness that suggested for the first time plainly, to Jonah's eye, a man beginning, slowly, to choose a side. "I'll file this," Garrick said, folding the note carefully into an evidence envelope. "Whatever else is true about the land dispute, threatening a man's livestock and leaving notes like this is plain criminal intimidation, and I intend to treat it as such." He looked at Jonah, something steadier in his expression than Jonah had seen from him yet. "I know I've been slow to show my hand in all this, Marrow. Man in my position doesn't get the luxury of moving fast. But I want you to know I'm not simply looking the other way anymore. Whatever this costs me." "Appreciate hearing it," Jonah said, and meant it, and felt, for the first time since the eviction notice arrived, a small, cautious flicker of hope that the ground beneath his feet wasn't quite as unstable as it had started to feel. That evening, once Garrick had ridden back toward town, Jonah and Sanoa stood together on the porch, watching the sun go down hard red over the ridge. The eviction notice still sitting unread a second time on the kitchen table inside, because reading it once had already told them everything they needed to know about the shape of the fight ahead. "They're coming at us from every side," Sanoa said, quiet. "The bank, the law, my own people even, some of them. Now cattle and threats left on our own fence line. Feels like there's nowhere left that's simply safe." "Maybe there isn't," Jonah said. "Maybe safe was never really on the table, not for people like us, not in a valley run by men like Whitfield." He looked at her, steady, despite everything pressing down on both their shoulders. "But I'll tell you what is on the table. I'm not signing that land over. Not walking away from you because some court in Tucson says our marriage doesn't count. Not letting a man who forges dead men's signatures decide what this valley gets to look like." Bold words, she said, for a man who used to keep his head down and mind his own fences. Man changes, given the right reason. He reached over, careful, and took her hand, and she let him, her fingers curling into his without hesitation. Found mine at a creek a few weeks back. Not about to let it go now, whatever it costs to keep. She was quiet a long moment, watching the last of the light bleed out over the ridge, and when she finally spoke, her voice had gone low and fierce and certain, in a way that steadied something in his own chest that had been shaking, quietly, since the fence cutters had left their bloody warning 2 mornings before. "Then we hold," she said, "together, whatever comes." In Willow Bend that same evening, a man Sheriff Garrick didn't recognize slipped quietly through the back door of the bank. After closing hours, the same leader of the bounty crew who'd fled the creek weeks before, older now around the eyes, carrying himself with the wary carefulness of a man who'd learned the hard way not to underestimate a rancher with a rifle and a reason. "We've watched the place 3 nights running," the man told Whitfield low, across the desk, "learned the patterns. The woman sharper than most hears things a man half her age would miss. Won't be an easy taking, whenever we move. I'm not paying you to take anything yet," Whitfield said, unbothered, still bent over his survey map. "I'm paying you to be ready the moment I say the word. There's a legal process unfolding first. Court documents. An eviction if the judge cooperates, which he will given what this bank has quietly done for that particular judge's re-election fund over the years." He looked up at last, something cold and patient in his expression. "If the law does its work cleanly, your services may not be needed at all. But laws have a way of getting complicated. Out here, when the wrong sheriff develops a conscience at the wrong moment, I'd rather have you ready and unused than needed and absent. And if it comes to needed, then you'll earn considerably more than you did at the creek," Whitfield said. "And this time, I'd suggest not underestimating the woman a second time. Mistakes of that particular kind tend to prove expensive." He returned his attention to the map, dismissive, already finished with the conversation. "Stay close, stay patient. I'll send word when the time comes." The man let himself back out the way he'd come, and Whitfield sat alone a long while after, tracing the proposed railroad line across the map with one careful finger, already picturing the day not far off now. By his calculation, when Shadow Creek Valley belonged to men with vision enough to see its true worth, rather than to a stubborn, grief-hardened rancher who'd made the singular mistake of falling in love with the wrong kind of trouble. Out past the ridge, unseen by either of them, dust rose faint on the horizon riders, patient and well-funded, closing the distance 1 careful mile at a time, and somewhere in Willow Bend, Sterling Whitfield sat at his desk in the lamplight, reviewing a survey map of railroad land, with the particular satisfied calm of a man who believed, with every soft-handed certainty he possessed, that the walls he'd built around Jonah Merrow's whole world were very nearly finished closing. He was not entirely wrong. He was not entirely right either, and the difference between those two things was about to matter more than he currently understood. Back at Shadow Creek, Jonah and Sonoa stood together on the porch a long while after the light had fully gone, saying nothing more, needing nothing more than the simple fact of each other's presence against everything still gathering unseen at the edges of their small and stubborn world. 30 days stood between them and ruin. A forged signature, an unrecognized marriage, a camp's wavering loyalty, and somewhere out past the dark tree line, men being paid for exactly the right moment to stop waiting. Neither of them could have said, standing there in that quiet, hard-won peace, which of those threats would strike first, or how close the coming weeks would bring them to losing everything they'd only just begun, cautiously, fiercely, to build. But they stood together anyway, hands joined, facing the dark and whatever came next. They intended to face it exactly that way. Together, or not at all. The 20 days after the eviction notice passed, slow, and then all at once, the way dread always seems to move, crawling, unbearable, until suddenly it isn't crawling anymore. It's sprinting straight at you, with no warning at all. Jonah and Sonoa spent those days doing what they could. Garrick's slow, careful work through the territorial archives. A lawyer in Tucson, recommended by a rancher friend, retained to prepare whatever defense the coming court date would require. Fences mended, cattle tended, the ordinary business of survival carried on stubbornly alongside the extraordinary business of simply holding on. They didn't speak much in those days about how frightened either of them was. Didn't need to. It sat plain enough in the tightness around Sonoa's eyes each morning, in the careful way Jonah checked and rechecked the rifle by the door each night, in the trip lines they'd strung and restrung along the northern approach more times than either could count. 22 days into the 30 they'd been given, Isha broke. He hadn't slept right in weeks. Told himself it was the cold coming early. Told himself it was nothing. Told himself a dozen small lies that all wore thin faster than the last one. Because a man can bury a thing under a stone and still hear it. Still feel its weight sitting there, patient, waiting on the one night he's too tired to keep pretending it isn't real. That night came on the 22nd day. He'd nearly walked to Tocho's lodge 3 times before that. Turned back each time. Because turning back was easier. Because confession meant consequence. And consequence meant the whole camp finally seeing him the way he'd feared. They already saw him small, jealous. The kind of man who'd trade another person's safety for the cold comfort of a little revenge. Except staying silent had started to feel like its own kind of consequence too. Heavier somehow, for being invisible. A man could hide a wrong from everyone but himself, and himself turned out to be the hardest witness of all to outrun. He lay awake that 22nd night listening to his own heartbeat, thinking about Sanoa's face at the ceremony, thinking about the rancher's steady voice choosing her over everything the camp expected, thinking about 6 armed guns waiting in the rocks above a creek that should have been safe. And something in him just broke, quietly, without drama. The particular quiet break of a man too tired to keep holding a lie steady against its own weight. He got up, got dressed, didn't let himself think past the next single step, because thinking too far ahead was exactly how he'd talked himself out of this 3 times already. He walked to Chief Tocho's lodge in the dark, handshaking, the pouch still mostly full. He'd never spent more than a few coins of it, as though spending it would have made the guilt permanent, instead of just heavy, clutched tight against his chest, like it might somehow apologize for itself if he held it close enough. Tocho was awake. Old men sleep light, and old men who've been shot once already sleep lighter still. Isha. No surprise in the old man's voice. Just tired recognition, like he'd been waiting on this visit a while without knowing exactly which night it would arrive. Sit. Isha didn't sit. Couldn't, stood there instead with the pouch trembling in his hands, and the whole ugly truth of it, finally climbing up out of his chest. I took money, he said, from a man working for whoever's trying to ruin the rancher. Told them the patterns at Shadow Creek. When he's off with the herd, when the house sits empty. His voice cracked. I told myself it was only information. Told myself I wasn't handing anyone a weapon. I was wrong. I've known I was wrong since the 2nd week, and I was too much of a coward to say so. Tocho said nothing for a long moment. The fire popped once, low, between them. How long ago, the old man said finally. Weeks, before the storm, before any of the notices came. Isha's throat was tight. I don't know what they've done with what I told them. I don't know if they're still watching. I only know I can't carry it silent one more night, whatever it costs me to say it out loud. It will cost you a great deal, Tocho said, not simply honest. You understand that. I understand it. Isha finally sank to his knees, the pouch falling from his hands, spilling coin across the dirt floor of the lodge, and he didn't reach to gather it back up. I would rather lose everything owning what I did than keep it one more day pretending I hadn't. Tocho studied him a long while, the old, weighing look of a chief who'd spent 40 years learning to separate a man's worst mistake from the whole of who he was. Then we ride tonight, Tocho said, already reaching for the blanket wrapped around his still-healing shoulder. Whatever is coming for Shadow Creek, it is coming soon, and it is coming because of what you handed to strangers with cold coin in their palms. You will help me warn them. That is the first stone on a very long road back, Isha. I suggest you start walking it now, while there is still time for the warning to matter. They rode through the dark at a pace that made Isha's still-healing conscience feel every bruising mile of it, and reached Shadow Creek just past 3 in the morning, and Jonah came out onto the porch with a rifle already in hand before either rider had fully reined in, Sanoa a half-step behind him, bow-strung. Both of them braced for exactly the kind of trouble that had, in fact, arrived, just not in the shape either of them expected. Tocho. Jonah lowered the rifle, confusion and alarm tangling together. What's happened? Trouble is what has happened, Tocho said, dismounting slow, his shoulder clearly protesting the ride. And I am afraid it has been happening a great deal longer than any of us realized. Isha stepped forward before he could lose his nerve a second time. Looked at Sanoa first, couldn't quite manage looking at Jonah yet, not until he'd said it plain to her. I sold information, he said, flat, forcing the words out before shame could swallow them back down, to men working for whoever wants this land. Told them your patterns. When the house sits empty, I did it out of wounded pride, and I have regretted it every single day since, and I am telling you now because I would rather you hate me with the truth in your hands than trust me one more day on a lie." The silence that followed was worse than any shouting could have been. Sanoa's face went through something complicated fury. First, sharp and immediate, her grip tightening on the bow, and then, slower, something that looked almost like grief, the ache of watching someone you'd known your whole life reveal a smallness you hadn't wanted to believe was in them. "How long?" she said, echoing Tocho's earlier question, her voice dangerously level. "Weeks. Weeks." She let that sit. Let it settle its full weight into the yard between them. "Do you understand what that means, what you've handed them?" She took a step closer, her voice dropping lower, harder. "I knew you. Trained beside you. Trusted you at my back in raids where trust was the only thing standing between living and dying. And you sold that trust for coin, out of nothing but wounded pride, and let it sit silent for weeks, while it put a target on the home I share with my husband. I know." Isha's voice cracked slightly. "I have no defense for it. Only the truth, finally, and whatever use you can make of it now. I do now." Isha didn't flinch from her anger, didn't look away, which was, Jonah thought, watching from a few feet off, about the only decent thing the man had done in this whole affair, standing still and taking what he'd earned rather than running from it. "I can't undo it. I can only warn you it's coming, and stand with you when it does, if you'll allow me that much." Jonah stepped forward, something cold and urgent, cutting through his own anger. There'd be time for reckoning later. Right now, there wasn't. "When?" he said. "How soon?" "I don't know exactly," Isha admitted. "But the men who paid me weren't patient types. And a legal deadline closing in 30 days gives men like that every reason to move before the courts settle anything on their own." He met Jonah's eyes at last, steady despite the shame written plain across his face. "I'd guess soon. Days, not weeks." Jonah looked at Sanoa. Sanoa looked back, and something passed between them without either needing to say it aloud, the silent communication of two people who'd learned, these past weeks, to read each other faster than words could manage. "Then we don't wait for soon to find us unprepared," Sanoa said. "We get ready."
Tonight.
Tocho, still catching his breath from the hard ride, insisted on staying despite Jonah's protest that he ought to rest somewhere safer. "I have already sent word to camp," the old chief said, firm despite his obvious exhaustion. "Warriors will follow within the day, should this stretch longer than tonight. But I will not sit safe in a lodge while the family bound to mine by a quarter-century's promise faces armed men alone. That is not how promises are kept, Jonah Marrow. Not the ones worth keeping." They worked through what remained of the dark and straight into the gray hour before dawn. Trip lines strung low across the northern approach, every gap in the fence checked and reinforced, ammunition counted and recounted, the old line shack stocked as a fallback position should the main house become untenable. Somewhere in the middle of it, hauling a coil of wire between them, Sanoa caught Jonah's eye across the yard and managed, despite everything, a small, tired smile. "Some wedding gift," she said. "A siege before we've even had a proper honeymoon. Didn't figure you for the honeymoon type. I'm not." She tied off the wire with quick, practiced hands. "But I'll allow I pictured our first month of marriage with slightly fewer bullets in it. Man can't give you everything," he said, and she huffed something that was almost a laugh, despite the exhaustion and fear sitting heavy in both their chests, and for just a moment, stringing wire in the gray pre-dawn light with death circling somewhere out past the ridge. It felt like exactly the kind of small, stubborn joy that made all of it worth defending in the first place. Isha worked alongside them the entire time, silent, grim, throwing himself into the labor with the particular fierce intensity of a man trying to outrun his own shame through sheer physical effort. He didn't ask forgiveness, didn't offer excuses, just worked, and Jonah found himself, somewhere around dawn, grudgingly respecting the man for at least that much for showing help clean up a mess of his own making, rather than simply disappearing back into the dark to avoid facing the consequences. Chief Tocho, too weak from the ride to help with the physical labor, sat instead near the porch, directing what he could from the chair Sanoa had brought out for him, his weathered face drawn tight with worry and old pain both. "You should be resting," Jonah told him, once there was a brief lull. I should be a great many things I am not currently able to be," Tocho said. "Dry despite everything. Rest can wait. This cannot." He studied Jonah a long moment, something heavy sitting behind his tired eyes. There is something I should tell you, Jonah Marrow. Something I have delayed too long already, out of caution that no longer serves either of us. The thing about my father. The thing about your father. Tocho drew a slow breath, gathering himself. 26 years ago, before you were born, your father and I were not strangers, as you have always believed. We were something closer to brothers, forged in a season of trouble very much like the one you are facing now, a different valley, a different set of men trying to take what wasn't theirs by right, but the same ugly shape of greed underneath it all. Jonah went very still. You knew him. Before the ranch. I knew him well enough that we made each other a promise, the two of us, the night we finally drove those old troubles off for good. A promise that whatever came after, however many years passed, however far our separate lives carried us, our two houses would stand for each other. Should either ever face a threat, neither could survive alone. Tocho's eyes were bright, unmistakably wet in the gray morning light. I did not fully understand the day you rode down off that ridge and fired a warning shot to save my life, that I was watching a promise made a quarter-century ago finally come due. I understand it now. I have understood it for some weeks, and I am sorry I did not have the courage to tell you sooner. What kind of trouble? Jonah asked low. The trouble you and he faced together. What was it? Tocho was quiet a moment, the old memory settling heavy across his weathered features. Land speculators. Not so different from Whitfield. In truth, though this territory has always seemed to breed men of his particular hunger with depressing regularity, they meant to drive my people off ground that had fed us for generations, and drive out the handful of settlers, your father included, who refused to sell their neighboring claims cheap enough to make the whole scheme profitable. Your father rode 2 days to warn my camp of an ambush being planned against us, much as you rode down off that ridge to warn us of another, all these years later. History does not repeat itself so much as it simply waits, patient, for the right descendants to prove themselves worthy of finishing what came before. And after, once the trouble passed, we sealed the promise the old way. Blood mixed in a shared fire, words spoken that neither of us ever repeated to another living soul, not even, I suspect, to your mother. Tocho's mouth curved, faint and sad. Some vows are not meant for retelling, only for keeping. Jonah stood there, the whole shape of the last weeks rearranging itself in his mind, the ceremony, the choosing, the debt that had never once felt like simple gratitude, all of it suddenly threaded through with something far older and far deeper than either of them had understood at the time. He never told me, Jonah said. Rough. Not once. Not in 12 years I had him left to ask. Some men carry their debts silent, Tocho said. Gentle. Your father was one of them. I suspect you already knew that about him, long before I confirmed it. Jonah thought of the ranch, built low and stubborn against the wind. Thought of a man who'd never once explained the particular fierceness with which he'd defended that land, that quiet, or the handful of times, scattered through Jonah's boyhood, that his father had ridden off alone for a day or two without explanation, and come back, saying nothing at all about where he'd been. He was keeping the promise, Jonah said slowly. All those years, wasn't he? Riding out to check on you, making sure your camp had what it needed, without ever once claiming credit for it. More than once, Tocho confirmed, quiet. He was a good man, your father. I have missed his friendship every year since he passed, and I am glad, whatever else this valley throws at us in the coming days, that his son has proven himself cut from exactly the same cloth. Jonah didn't trust his voice enough to answer that right away. Just stood there a long moment in the gray dawn light, feeling the shape of his whole life shift slightly, settle into a truer alignment than it had held before, and somewhere behind him, unnoticed, in the weight of the revelation, Sinua had gone quiet and still, watching him absorb it, her hand finding his without either of them needing to ask. They didn't have to wait long for the trouble Aisha's warning had promised. It came the following night, just past midnight, the same patient men from the creek, and a handful of new hired guns besides, moving in careful from 3 directions at once. Exactly the kind of coordinated approach that told Jonah, the moment the first trip line bell rang out sharp in the dark, that whoever was leading this assault had learned from their earlier failure and did not intend to fail twice. They're here, Sinua said, already moving, bow in hand, and the whole ranch erupted into motion. Jonah at the front window, the rifle Isha taking a position near the barn, Tocho, despite every protest, refusing to be moved from a defensible spot near the porch where his voice, at least, could still direct the fight even if his body couldn't fully join it. For one suspended heartbeat, Before the first shot came, the whole yard held perfectly still moonlight on gun barrels, shadows shifting careful along the tree line, the particular held breath quiet that exists in the last second before violence becomes unavoidable. Jonah would remember that heartbeat clearer than almost anything else about the whole terrible night. The last ordinary silence before everything, after it stopped being ordinary at all. The first shots came fast and close, splintering the porch rail inches from where Jonah crouched, and he returned fire at the muzzle flash he'd caught in the dark, heard a man cry out, didn't have time to feel anything about it beyond grim, focused relief that the shot had found its mark. Breathe. The thought came fractured, useless, the way thoughts do when a man's whole body has gone pure animal instinct. Count your shots. Watch the tree line. Don't think about her out there in the dark alone, except she's not alone. She's never alone. She's the most capable person in this fight, and you know it. So stop. Another muzzle flash. He fired back on pure reflex. Sanoa moved like something out of legend in that fight, low, fast, an arrow finding a target every time she drew. And when a man got close enough to grapple, she put him down with a knife, before Jonah had even registered the danger had closed that far. He'd known she was skilled, watching her fight for their home, for their life together, in the flesh, and not just in the stories the camp told about her. That was something else entirely, something that lodged itself in his chest as fierce pride, even in the middle of mortal danger. Left flank, she shouted, and he pivoted, caught a man scrambling over the fence line, fired, missed, fired again, didn't miss the second time. A bullet took a chunk out of the porch post beside his head, close enough that splinters stung his cheek, and for one dizzying second the whole world narrowed down to the ringing in his ears, and the wet warmth he was almost certain, panicked, was his own blood except it was just splinters, just close, too close, and he shoved the fear down hard, because there wasn't room for it right now, not with 3 more shadows advancing on the barn where Isha was fighting alone. The fighting stretched on, brutal and disorienting in the dark, muzzle flashes, and shouting and the terror of not knowing, moment to moment, whether the next shadow moving toward the house carried a friend or an enemy. Isha fought hard near the barn, taking down 2 men with a ferocity that looked, to Jonah's eye, very much like a man trying to buy back something he'd lost with the only currency he had left to offer. A third attacker nearly got the drop on him from behind, would have except Sanoa's arrow, found the man's shoulder first, spinning him off balance long enough for Ish to finish the fight with his own blade, and the look that passed between the 2 of them afterward, brief and wordless in the chaos, carried more forgiveness in it than either had words to offer yet. It was in the middle of that chaos that Chief Tocho, despite every instruction to stay low and stay covered, rose from his position to shout a warning at Isha, a rider bearing down on the young warrior's blind side, rifle already raised, and took a bullet meant for someone else for the second time in his life, defending this fragile, hard-won alliance. He went down hard. Tocho! Jonah was moving before he'd consciously decided to, Sanoa a half-step behind him, both of them reaching the old chief's side as the fighting, mercifully, began at last to break the attackers, having lost the element of surprise in several of their own number, starting to fall back into the dark, rather than press an assault that was costing them more than whoever was paying expected them to lose. Tocho was bleeding heavy from the shoulder, the same shoulder, Jonah realized, with a sick lurch that had barely finished healing from the first wound at the creek. "Stay with us," Sanoa said, pressing hard against the wound, with the same steady competence she'd shown that first day, though her voice shook now in a way Jonah had never heard from her. "Stay with us, old man. You don't get to leave this fight now. Not after everything." Tocho's eyes fluttered, found Jonah's face in the chaos. The promise he managed, weak blood loss already dragging at his words. "Tell your children, whatever happens to me tonight. Tell them the promise still stands, between our houses, so long as either one endures." "You're going to tell them yourself," Jonah said, fierce, refusing to let the old man's words settle into anything resembling a goodbye. "You hear me, Tocho? You're not finishing this story tonight." Whether the old chief heard him or not, his eyes had already slipped shut, and Sanoa was shouting for cloth, for anything to slow the bleeding, and the night around them, having finally driven off its attackers, settled into the particular ringing silences that follows violence, a silence that felt, in that terrible moment, entirely unwilling to promise anyone a happy ending. They got him stable. Barely. Sanoa's hands, Steady even now, packed the wound tight and bound it firm, and between her skill and whatever stubborn will had kept the old man alive through worse fights than this one, Tocho's breathing settled into something ragged but consistent by the time the first gray light of dawn began creeping over the ridge. "He'll live," Sanoa said finally, sitting back on her heels, exhaustion and relief wearing plain across her face. "If infection doesn't take him, if he rests properly, which I already know he won't do without a fight of his own." "Small mercy," Jonah said, "given the fight we all just survived." They surveyed the damage as the light grew, 2 of the attackers dead. 3 more wounded badly enough they'd fled rather than press further. No sign yet of whoever had actually organized the assault, though Jonah had a cold, certain feeling about exactly whose name belonged at the bottom of that particular ledger. Isha, blood-streaked and shaking with the aftermath of his first real fight in weeks, approached slowly, uncertain of his welcome. "He's alive because I called the warning too late to stop the shot aimed at me," he said, low, guilt written plain across every line of his face. "I don't know how a man carries that." "You carry it," Sanoa said. "Not unkind, but not soft either. The same way you carried the guilt of taking the coin in the first place. Forward. Doing better with every day that follows, rather than letting one mistake convince you there's no road back from it." She met his eyes. "You rode out here in the dark to warn us, Isha. You fought tonight harder than most men twice your training. That doesn't erase what you did, but it's a start. Tocho would tell you the same, if he could speak right now." Isha nodded, throat working, and said nothing further, and Jonah understood, watching him, that whatever reckoning still waited for the young warrior back at camp, and there would be one. The elders would see to that the man standing in front of them now had at least begun the long, uncomfortable work of becoming someone worth trusting again. There was a brief lull, once the wounded had been tended and the dead accounted for, before the day's next demands came calling, a stretch of maybe 20 minutes, where the whole exhausted household simply sat in the gray morning light, saying nothing, letting the adrenaline finally drain out of bodies that had been running on pure fight for hours. Jonah found Sanoa sitting alone near the well, her bow set aside, her hands steady through the whole fight, steady through binding Tocho's wound finally, now that there was nothing left demanding steadiness of them, beginning to shake. He sat down beside her without a word. Let the silence hold a while before either of them tried to fill it. "I keep seeing it," she said finally low. "The moment he went down. Thought for one whole second we'd lost him. Thought I'd have to explain to the whole camp why the alliance my own choosing helped forge had gotten their chief killed. Wasn't your doing," Jonah said. "Any of it. I know that. Knowing it and feeling it aren't always the same animal." She looked at her own hands, still faintly trembling, and pressed them flat against her knees like she could will the shaking still through sheer stubbornness. "I've been in worse fights than this one. Raids that cost more lives, faster, bloodier. Never once shook like this after." A pause, something raw creeping into her voice. "Difference is, I don't usually have this much left to lose when the fighting starts." Jonah reached over, careful, and took one of her shaking hands in both of his, steady, warm, not trying to still the shake so much as simply holding it, letting her know she didn't have to hold it alone. "Neither do I," he said. "Lose you in that fight, and I don't rightly know what's left of me worth salvaging afterward. Learned that lesson once already the hard way. Didn't much care to test it a second time." She looked at him a long moment, exhaustion and fear and something fiercer than both moving behind her eyes, and leaned into him, just slightly, just enough, and they sat there together in the gray dawn light a while longer, 2 people who'd survived the worst night either had faced since the ceremony, finding in each other's steady presence exactly the kind of quiet that battle never left room for, but always eventually made space to arrive. Word of the attack reached Willow Bend by mid-morning, carried inevitably by one of the fleeing hired guns, nursing a wound and a grudge in equal measure, and by early afternoon Sheriff Garrick himself rode hard for Shadow Creek, his face grim, a leather satchel of documents strapped tight across his saddle. "Heard there was shooting out this way," he said, dismounting fast. "Heard men are dead." "Heard right," Jonah said, tired beyond measure, standing watch over a chief who was, God willing, going to survive the night. "Hired guns. Same crew from the creek, best we can tell, with reinforcements besides." Garrick's jaw tightened. "I've got something that might matter, given all this." He patted the satchel. "Spent the better part of 3 weeks quiet checking Every record I could find on that loan document Whitfield produced. Territorial Archive in Tucson finally sent back the original filing paperwork for this ranch, going back to your father's founding claim. He pulled out a folded page, held it steady despite his obvious exhaustion. Signature doesn't match. Not close. And there's more a ledger entry from the bank itself, dated a full 2 years after your father's death, showing the supposed loan was never actually disbursed at all. Whole thing's a fabrication from top to bottom, Marrow. I can prove it now. Properly. In front of a judge. He glanced past Jonah then, taking in the full scene for the first time, the bodies laid out under blankets near the barn. Sanoa's blood-stained hands, Chief Tocho pale and unconscious inside the house, and something in his weathered face cracked open with genuine horror. This is what he was willing to cost. Garrick said quiet, more to himself than to Jonah. I sat in that man's office and watched him calculate profit off a survey map while good people bled for it. Told myself I was staying neutral, staying within the law. He shook his head slow, disgusted with himself. There's no neutral in a thing like this, is there? Never was. I just wanted there to be, because neutral was easier. Something in Jonah's chest, wound tight for weeks, finally began to loosen. Why now? He asked, genuinely curious. You've had reason to move slower than this. Reason enough that I understood the delay, even resented it a little. Garrick was quiet a moment, something old and tired, and finally, decided, settling into his weathered face. Because a man can only watch so many wrongs get dressed up as law before something in him refuses to keep quiet about it any longer, he said. My brother told me something a few weeks back. Told me he'd rather lose the store than watch me trade my conscience for his comfort. Took me longer than it should have to listen to him properly. He looked toward the house, toward the chief lying wounded inside it, toward the whole ugly cost of Whitfield's ambition laid plain across this one battered ranch. This is where it stops, far as I'm concerned. I'm riding into town within the hour, and I'm bringing this evidence straight to Judge Holloway, and I'm doing it in front of as many witnesses as I can gather along the way. Whitfield's had this town silenced too long. Time somebody made noise instead. The confrontation, when it finally came, happened in the middle of Willow Bend's main street, in front of half the town, which was, Jonah would think later, exactly the kind of public reckoning a man like Sterling Whitfield least wanted and most deserved. Garrick rode in with the evidence in hand, Jonah and Sanoa flanking him, Sanoa having insisted, flatly, that she would not be left behind for the reckoning of a fight that had cost her people blood, and nearly cost her a chief she loved like family. Word had spread fast enough that a crowd had already gathered outside the bank by the time they arrived, drawn by rumor of the previous night's violence and hungry, the way small towns always are, for whatever spectacle came next. Jonah felt every eye on them as they rode in, the same particular weight of scrutiny that had once made this street feel like walking through hostile country. Except something in the crowd's posture had shifted, since that last visit, less the cold, deliberate silence of judgment already rendered, more the uncertain, watchful silence of people who'd heard enough rumor overnight to suspect the story they'd been told about their neighbors might not hold up to closer examination. Steady, he told himself, dismounting. Whatever happens here, you've got nothing left to prove to this street. Already proved it, out at the ranch, in blood if it came to that. Whitfield stepped out onto the bank's porch, composed as ever, though something flickered behind his eyes at the sight of Garrick's satchel. Sheriff, Mr. Marrow. His gaze moved to Sanoa, and whatever contempt he might have shown weeks before had thinned into something more careful now, more wary. I trust this visit concerns last night's unfortunate violence out at Shadow Creek. Terrible business. I do hope you're not implying my bank had any connection to it. I'm not implying anything, Garrick said, loud enough to carry across the gathered crowd. I'm stating fact. This loan document, he held it high, is a forgery. The signature doesn't match old Marrow's founding claim on file at the Territorial Archive. And this ledger, he held up the second paper, proves your own bank never disbursed the loan you claim he defaulted on. You built a legal case on a lie, Sterling, and you built it to steal a dead man's land out from under his living son. A murmur rippled through the crowd, sharp with sudden shifting suspicion. An old rancher near the front, a man Jonah recognized vaguely from the outskirts of the valley, one of the small outfits Whitfield had circled for years, pushed forward, his weathered face dark with dawning understanding. I sold my south pasture to this man 8 months back, he said. loud enough for the whole street to hear. Told me it was a fair price, given the drought. Told me the bank had no choice but to call in my note early. He looked at Garrick's papers, then at Whitfield, something cold settling into his expression. Was that a lie too, Sterling's? Same as this one? Another voice joined, then another, the crowd's murmur swelling fast now into something with real teeth in it. The particular collective unease of a town realized all at once that a story it had trusted for years might have been rotten clear through the whole time. That is an entirely separate matter, Whitfield said, though his voice had lost its earlier smooth certainty. I've got the proper documentation right here. Garrick cut in, and I've got a judge waiting on my testimony within the hour. And while we're airing serious accusations, Sterling, perhaps you'd care to explain to this crowd exactly how a peaceful ranch came under armed assault by hired guns not 12 hours after your bank-filed suit to seize it. Coincidence of that particular size strains credulity, even for a town as patient with you as this one's been. Whitfield's eyes swept the crowd, the same crowd that had, weeks before, gone cold and silent at the mere sight of Jonah and Sanoa walking together down this exact street, now watching him, instead, with something considerably less friendly. He understood, Jonah could see, exactly how fast that particular tide could turn against a man once it started moving. This is absurd, Whitfield said, though his voice had lost its earlier smooth certainty. I've done nothing but pursue a legitimate Sterling. A new voice cut through the crowd, Purdy, the same thin cattle buyer who'd carried the ceremony's news to town weeks before, pushing forward with an expression caught somewhere between guilt and grim resolve. I think you ought to stop talking. I've heard some things these past weeks. About railroad surveys. About men you've been quietly meeting with in Tucson. Didn't think much of it at the time. Thinking a great deal more of it now, watching this. The crowd's murmur sharpened into something closer to an ugly, rising anger, and Whitfield, watching his careful architecture of lies collapse in real time before an audience he could no longer control, took a single step backward toward the bank's door. You forged my husband's father's signature, Sanoa said, her voice cutting clean and hard across the murmuring crowd, the first words she'd spoken since arriving, and every eye in the street swung toward her at once. You hired men to attack a chief who nearly died defending his own people. You sat in your bank and calculated the cost of stealing a family's land against the profit of a railroad line, and you never once, in all your calculating, counted the actual cost in blood. She let the silence that followed sit a long moment before finishing. I have watched men like you before, Sterling Whitfield. Men who believe cruelty dressed up as paperwork isn't cruelty at all. I have never once watched one of you get away with it for long. Whitfield's jaw tightened, some last thread of his composure fraying entirely at being addressed so plainly, so publicly, by a woman he'd spent months trying to erase from legal existence altogether. Sheriff, Jonah said, quiet but carrying, I believe you've got grounds for an arrest. Garrick nodded once, grim satisfaction settling into his tired face. I believe I do, he stepped forward. Sterling Whitfield, you're under arrest, pending more charges of fraud, forgery, and conspiracy in the attempted seizure of private property. You'll come with me now, quiet, or you'll come with me otherwise. Your choice. Whitfield's eyes darted once more across the crowd, searching for some ally, some sympathy, some crack in the wall of judgment now surrounding him on every side, and found none. His shoulders sagged. Finally, the last of his composure draining away into something small and defeated. This isn't finished, he said low, more to himself than anyone else, as Garrick moved to bind his hands. There are men in Tucson who won't take kindly to this interference. Then those men can take it up with the judge same as you're about to, Garrick said, unmoved, and led him away through a crowd that parted for him with a silence considerably different in texture than the silence that had once greeted Jonah and Sanoa's own arrival, this silence carrying judgment of an entirely different and finally deserved direction. Garrick stopped by the small jail cell before locking it, unable to resist one final word, though he'd told himself the whole ride into town that he wouldn't bother. You had a whole town's worth of goodwill, Sterling, he said quiet, through the bars. Could have built something real with it, if you'd wanted to. Instead, you spent years buying silence and calling it respect. Now you've got neither. Whitfield sat on the narrow cot, all his earlier smooth composure finally, entirely stripped away, leaving behind something smaller and more ordinary than the calculating man who'd stood on that bank porch weeks before. You'll regret this, Ambrose, he said, though the threat carried none of its old weight. Men like me don't simply disappear because one sheriff finds his conscience. Maybe not, Garrick allowed. But you'll disappear from this valley at least. And that's more than I figured I'd manage a month back, if I'm honest with myself. He turned to go, then paused. For what it's worth, I am sorry it took me this long to choose right. Wish I could tell you that regret keeps you warm at night. But it doesn't. Learned that the hard way myself this past month. He left Whitfield alone with that, the cell doors locked, clicking final and heavy in the quiet jailhouse, and rode back toward Shadow Creek feeling, for the first time in longer than he could remember, entirely at peace with the man he saw looking back at him in the washroom mirror each morning. He stopped at his brother's store on the way, found Silas closing up for the evening, and simply said, "It's done. Whitfield's in a cell. Told him plain what I thought of the debt he'd tried to hold over me." Silas set down the ledger he'd been closing, studied his brother a long moment. "How's it sit with you, now that it's done?" "Lighter," Garrick admitted. Something almost like a smile finding his tired face for the first time in weeks. Didn't expect it to feel quite this light. Thought doing right would cost more than it did. "Doing right usually costs plenty up front," Silas said. "Just tends to pay itself back a good deal faster than doing wrong ever manages to." He came around the counter, clapped his brother on the shoulder, brief and warm. "Proud of you, Ambrose. Took you longer than either of us would have liked, but you got there. That's what matters, in the end." Garrick nodded, throat tight, and rode home that evening feeling, for the first time in longer than either brother could easily remember, like the weight he'd been carrying quietly between them had finally, fully lifted. Chief Toe recovered slowly over the following days, his strength returning in careful increments, and the news of Whitfield's arrest, once it reached the camp, did more to settle the lingering doubts of elders like Chagra than any argument Tocho could have made from a sickbed. The debt was tested. Tocho reminded the reconvened council, still weak but insistent on speaking the words himself. "As I said it would be, and the man who married our daughter did not run from that test. Neither did she." He looked toward Chagra specifically. "I believe the question of whether this alliance was wisdom has answered itself rather thoroughly, has it not?" Chagra, to his credit, inclined his head in something close to an apology. "It has," he admitted. "I was wrong to doubt it. I am glad to say so plainly, now that the saying costs me only my pride and not my honesty." He paused, something more searching in his expression. "I will confess something further, Tocho, since honesty seems to be the order of the day. I doubted not only the alliance, but the wisdom of choosing kindness toward outsiders at all, after so many years of watching kindness go unrewarded or worse, punished. I'm glad to have been wrong about that too. We are none of us made wiser by comfort," Tocho said, gentle. "Only by trial, and by choosing each time, whether trial makes us smaller or larger than we were before it. I am glad you have chosen larger, my old friend." The matter of Isha proved more complicated and took longer to settle. The council did not call for his exile, nor for any punishment so severe as to end his place among his people. Entirely, Taco argued strongly against it, pointing to the warning ride, the fight at the ranch, the plain and difficult courage of a man choosing, eventually, to confess a wrong rather than let it fester unspoken. But neither did the matter pass without real consequence. Isha was stripped, for a full year, of any voice in council matters, and set to work rebuilding what trust he'd broken through service to the camp's most vulnerable, the elderly, the sick, the very people whose safety his selfish choice had once endangered. He accepted the judgment without complaint, and Sanoa, watching him take up that difficult, humbling work in the weeks that followed, found herself slowly, cautiously willing to call him something closer to a friend again than she'd expected to manage, given everything. She found him one afternoon, weeks into his service, sitting with an elderly widow who could no longer gather her own firewood, patiently splitting logs into a neat stack beside her lodge without being asked twice, and something in the quiet, unglamorous diligence of it settled a question she hadn't fully realized she was still asking herself. "You've changed," she said, approaching. "Trying to." Isha set the axe down, wiped sweat from his brow despite the cool autumn air. "Doesn't undo what I did. Understand that plainly enough. But maybe it's worth something, the trying." "It is," Sanoa said, and meant it. "I won't pretend I've forgotten what happened. But I don't carry the anger the way I did those first weeks. Watching you do this," she gestured at the neat stack of wood. "It's not nothing, Isha. Building something honest, log by log, after tearing something down. That takes its own kind of courage. He looked at her a long moment, something like relief and grief tangled together crossing his face. Thank you, he said simple, for saying so, for not making me carry the whole of it alone even now. We none of us carry anything entirely alone, Sanoa said, echoing words she'd first heard from Tocho himself, months before, in a conversation about a very different kind of debt. Least of all inside a camp small enough that everyone's mistakes and everyone's mending both belong, eventually, to all of us together. The forged loan case collapsed within the month, the territorial court finding decisively in Jonah's favor once Garrick's evidence was laid out in full, and with it, the petition questioning the marriage's legal, standing quietly, dissolved as well, no longer sustained by anyone with sufficient motive or money to keep pressing it. Purdy, of all people, proved instrumental in the larger reckoning that followed, coming forward with detailed accounts of the meetings he'd witnessed between Whitfield and railroad surveyors, from Tucson meetings that revealed a scheme far larger than one contested ranch, stretching across a dozen small claims throughout the valley that Whitfield had spent 2 years quietly maneuvering to acquire through debt, intimidation, and forged paper alike. Once investigators began pulling at that thread, the whole rotten fabric of it came apart fast, other ranchers who'd quietly sold out under similar pressure finally finding the courage to speak. Once they understood, they weren't alone in having been cheated. Whitfield himself faced trial in Tucson some months later, the railroad scheme unraveling thread by thread, as investigators picked apart every corner of his careful ambitions. And though Jonah and Sanoa did not attend that particular reckoning, word eventually reached them that the bank's charter had been revoked entirely, its assets seized, its founder facing a prison sentence long enough to ensure Willow Bend, at least, would trouble them no further. Several of the ranchers who'd sold under duress found their old claims restored, in whole or in part, a small but real correction to years of quiet theft dressed up as ordinary business. The town itself changed, slowly, in the aftermath, not all at once, not universally, because prejudice this deep rarely dissolves overnight, simply because its worst champion has been publicly disgraced. But something shifted regardless. Mrs. Halloran, of all people, was the first to offer an unprompted apology, stiff and awkward but sincere, the next time Sanoa came into the store. Others followed, slower, more grudging, but real all the same, the halting decency of a town realizing gradually that the story it had told itself about its neighbors had been built on considerably less truth than it had assumed. Chief Tocho spent the better part of a month recovering at Shadow Creek itself, too weak at first for the ride back to camp, and Sanoa insisted he stay in the very room she'd first slept. In the night after the wedding, the room Jonah had once offered without expectation, now offered again in the same spirit to the man who'd very nearly died twice over protecting the fragile bond between their two houses. Jonah found himself, in those quiet weeks of recovery, spending long evenings at the old chief's bedside, and something between them deepened past gratitude into something closer to the family bond Tocho had described from a quarter-century before. Your father would have liked watching this, Tocho said, one such evening, gesturing weakly at the small domestic scene around them. Sanoa mending a shirt by the lamplight, Isha still working through his year of service, hauling water for the old man's evening tea without being asked. All of it, the mending fences, in every sense a man could mean the phrase. Wish he'd told me, Jonah admitted, not for the first time. About you. About all of it. Might have made these last years easier, knowing there was a whole history I was carrying, without understanding the weight of it. Perhaps, Tocho allowed. Or perhaps the not knowing was its own kind of gift in the end. You chose Sanoa without any awareness of the old promise pulling at you, chose her clean, on nothing but what you saw standing in front of you that morning. His eyes, tired but warm, I think your father would have been prouder of that particular ignorance than he'd have been of any calculated fulfillment of an old debt. You did not honor the promise because you knew of it. You honored it because you were, in your own right, exactly the kind of man who would have made the same promise himself, given the same circumstance. Jonah sat with that a long moment, something settling warm and certain in his chest. Still, wish he told me, he said finally, quiet. Would have liked to hear him say it himself just once. He is saying it, Tocho said, gentle. Through every acre of this land he left you well tended. Through every lesson, he taught you about standing firm when the wind wants to knock a man sideways. A father's voice does not end simply because his breath does. Jonah Marrow. I suspect you already know that better than most. Jonah climbed the rise to the cottonwood tree again the following morning, and this time Sanoa came with him, unasked, simply falling into step beside him as he walked, the way she'd learned to do with most things that mattered to him. They stood together a long while at the two weathered graves, saying nothing at first, the autumn wind moving soft through the cottonwood's thinning leaves. I used to think visiting meant I was choosing them over living, Jonah said finally. Rachel, the life we didn't get to have. Thought coming up here too often meant I hadn't let go enough to deserve whatever came next. He looked at Sanoa, something unguarded in his face. Don't think that anymore. Think maybe the coming up here is exactly what lets me hold both. What was and what's happening now. Sanoa crouched down beside the smaller of the two markers, the one that had never gotten a name carved into it, and rested her palm flat against the weathered wood, gentle, unhurried. I never had a grave of my own to visit, she said quietly. Not for my mother. Our dead are given to the earth differently. No marker left standing to visit later. I used to envy people who had a fixed place to bring their grief, a door they could knock on, even knowing no one would answer. She looked up at him. I understand it better now, having stood here with you enough times to feel the shape of what this particular door means to you. Would you want one? Jonah asked, gentle. A marker. For your mother. We could make one, if it'd bring you any peace. She considered that a long moment. Something moved in grateful passing behind her eyes. Maybe, she said. Not yet. But maybe, someday. It's a kind thought, Jonah Marrow. One I didn't expect to be offered by anyone, let alone a man raised in a tradition that doesn't share our way of grieving. Figured grief doesn't much care what tradition raised a person, he said. Just cares that somebody's carrying it, and could use a little help with the weight now and then. She stood and took his hand, and together they stood a while longer at the small, quiet rise, the two of them, and the whole tangled, hard-won history of everything that had brought them to this exact spot, before finally turning and making their way back down toward the house, toward the living, toward whatever came next in a life neither of them had expected to be granted a second chance at building. The wedding, the proper one, the one meant to satisfy both the territory's law and the deepest customs of Sanoa's own people, took place on a clear autumn morning some 6 weeks after the attack, on the rise above Shadow Creek where the cottonwood tree stood watch over two familiar graves, and, now, over the beginning of something entirely new. Jonah had spent that final morning alone for a short while, before the guests arrived, standing near the fence line he'd mended 100 times over since that first storm, the same fence line where all of this had truly begun, though he hadn't known it at the time, chasing storm-scattered posts on an ordinary morning that turned out to be anything but. The morning came in bright and cold, and utterly without the gray, held breath stillness of that first ceremony months before. Frost still clung to the grass in the shadowed places, catching the early light like something scattered deliberately for the occasion, and the whole rise smelled of wood smoke and crushed sage, and the particular sweetness of autumn cottonwood leaves just beginning to turn. Sanoa wore this time a dress of her own, choosing not the plain practical clothes of an ordinary working day, but not Maeva's elaborate ceremonial beading either. Something in between, something entirely hers. Soft duskin, worked with a simple line of turquoise beads along the collar that Maeva herself had helped stitch, her hair loose for once, instead of bound tight and practical, catching the morning light in a way that made Jonah, watching her walk up the rise toward him, forget entirely how to form a coherent thought. You're staring, she murmured. Once she'd reached him, an echo of the very first thing she'd ever said to him at that first camp weeks and a lifetime ago. Some things are worth staring at. Careful, people will talk. Let them, he said, and meant it every bit as much as he had the first time. Chief Tocho, strong enough now to stand unaided, though he still favored the healing shoulder, performed the Apache portion of the ceremony himself, his voice carrying clear and strong across the small gathering of both camps, his own people, and a scattering of Willow Bend residents who'd ridden out, this time, not for spectacle, but for genuine goodwill. He spoke of promises kept across generations, of debts that transformed, given time and honesty, into something far more valuable than the transaction that began them. And more than once his voice caught, thick with an emotion he made no effort to hide from the gathered crowd. a traveling circuit preacher, passing through the territory on his regular rounds, performed the second half the plain, familiar words Jonah had once spoken over Rachel's grave, now spoken instead over a new beginning. And if some part of him ached, quiet and permanent, at the echo of that old ceremony, he'd made his peace, weeks before, with the understanding that love didn't require forgetting, only room enough to hold both. Maeva stood beside Sanoa throughout, radiant with an unspoken joy of her own that Jonah suspected, correctly, had something to do with a young warrior he'd noticed lingering rather too close to her side these past weeks, a story, he figured, that would find its own telling in its own time, same as every good story eventually did in this valley. She caught his eye once, mid-ceremony, and offered the smallest, most knowing smile, as though confirming exactly what he'd already guessed. Sanoa told him the fuller shape of it later, during the evening's quieter celebration, how Maeva had confessed weeks before that the young warrior in question was a man from a neighboring band, met during a trading visit 2 summers back, and that her father had known nothing of the attachment until Maeva finally found the courage, emboldened by watching Jonah choose Sanoa so openly against every expectation, to bring the matter to Tocho herself. He gave his blessing without a moment's hesitation, Sanoa said, smiling. Told her he'd spent too many years assuming he understood what would make his daughter happy, without ever once simply asking her directly. Apparently, your example shamed a whole camp's worth of old assumptions loose, all at once. Didn't mean to start a trend, Jonah said, though something warm and pleased sat behind the words regardless. Didn't have to mean to, Sanoa said. Sometimes a person just has to be brave once, publicly, and the bravery does the rest of the work on its own, spreading quiet through a whole community before anyone's fully aware it's happening. Isha stood near the back of the gathering, quiet, watchful, still working through the long year of his penance, but present all the same. And when the ceremony reached its close, he was among the first to step forward and offer his blessing, sincere in a way that suggested the hardest, most honest work of rebuilding a man's character had well and truly begun. Sheriff Garrick stood near the edge of the gathering too, hat in hand, looking somewhat out of place among the mixed crowd, but plainly glad to be there regardless. And even Mrs. Halloran had ridden out, bringing a small gift of preserves as a wordless, awkward, entirely genuine peace offering. When Tocho finally pronounced the union complete in both tongues, both traditions, both laws finally reconciled into one single unbroken vow, the gathered crowd erupted into something between cheering and quiet, tearful applause, and Jonah, looking out over the mingled faces of 2 peoples who'd spent months circling each other with suspicion and fear, felt something settle deep and permanent in his chest, the particular, hard-won understanding that the valley itself had changed, slowly, imperfectly, but genuinely alongside the 2 people standing at the center of it. That evening, once the gathering had thinned and the fires had burned low, Jonah and Sanoa climbed the rise up above the house together, away from the last of the celebration, and stood looking down over the whole quiet sweep of Shadow Creek Valley as the sun bled slow and gold toward the western ridge. Feels strange, Jonah admitted, standing here married twice over in one day, and still feeling like the luckiest man in this whole territory. You are, Sanoa said, though I'll allow you're also the most stubborn, which balances the account somewhat. He laughed, real and unguarded, and pulled her close, and for a long while neither of them said anything at all, simply watched the light change over land that had cost them nearly everything to keep, and given them, in exchange, more than either had believed themselves capable of holding again. My father used to stand right here, Jonah said, eventually quiet. Never told me why, exactly. Just used to disappear up this rise of an evening and stand a long while, looking out over everything, like he was keeping watch over something he never quite explained. Keeping a promise, Sanoa said. The way men like your father keep the truest ones quietly, without ever needing credit for the keeping. Reckon so. Jonah looked out over the valley, the 2 weathered graves just visible in the gathering dusk beneath the cottonwood tree, the whole hard, costly, beautiful shape of everything he'd built and rebuilt, and finally truly earned. Suppose it's my turn now. Keeping watch. Keeping the promise going for whoever comes after us to inherit it. Whoever comes after us, Sanoa repeated, something soft and private moving behind her eyes, and Jonah understood, from the way she said it, that the words carried a weight neither of them was quite ready to speak aloud plainly. Not yet, though the possibility of it a future, A family, a whole new chapter neither expected themselves capable of wanting again, after everything they'd separately buried, sat warm and unspoken between them regardless. Sanoa's hand found his, steady, certain, and neither of them said much more than that, letting the moment settle into something that didn't need finishing in words. They stood together on that rise as the last light faded gold, and then violet, and then, finally, the deep, quiet blue of a clear autumn evening, and walked back down to the house together once the cold set in, leaving the rest of the story to write itself the way the best ones always do, slowly, and in the living of it. Some months later, well into the following spring, a rider passing through Shadow Creek Valley, on his way to Tucson, might have paused, as travelers sometimes did, to water his horse at the creek that gave the valley its name, and looked up toward the ranch house on the rise to see a sight that would have seemed, not so very long before, almost impossible to imagine in that particular stretch of territory. A rancher and his wife working fence line together, easy and practiced in each other's company, trading words too quiet to carry across the distance, but clearly, unmistakably fond. An old Apache chief, fully recovered now, riding out from camp for one of his regular visits, greeted by both of them with the warmth reserved for family rather than obligation. A young warrior, formerly disgraced, now simply another welcome face among the ranch hands Jonah had begun hiring from both camps as the operation grew, his year of penance completed, his place among his people slowly, steadily rebuilt. The valley itself had settled into something neither Jonah nor Sanoa could have predicted. That gray morning of the ceremony, so many months before, not perfect, not entirely free of the old suspicions that still occasionally surfaced in a sideways glance or a too careful silence, but changed regardless, softened at its hardest edges by the simple, stubborn example of two people who'd refused to let a valley's fear decide the shape of their marriage. And on the rise above the house, beneath the cottonwood tree, 3 markers stood now, instead of 2, the newest, small, freshly carved, honoring a mother Sanoa had never had the chance to properly grieve until a husband who understood grief better than most had helped her build the door she'd always wished she'd had. Some promises are made in a single dramatic moment, spoken loud enough for a whole camp to hear. Others are made quieter, renewed daily, in the small, unglamorous work of choosing, again and again, to stand beside someone when standing costs something real. Jonah Marrow had learned, in the space of one extraordinary year, that both kinds mattered. But it was the second kind he'd come to believe, watching Sanoa laugh at something one of the ranch hands said, her whole face open and unguarded in a way it had rarely been. That first difficult week, it was the second kind that actually built a life worth living inside of. One ordinary, hard-won, deeply grateful day at a time. Not a promise made of pretty words. A promise made of standing, together exactly where the ground had shifted hardest beneath them, and refusing, both of them, ever again to let it shift them apart. The end.